They beat the oars with their calloused hands, and the sea answered. In the gray hour before dawn, when the world seemed held inside a great shell of mist, and the foam along the rocks breathed like a sleeping animal, the Iron Fleet lay at anchor off Fair Isle. Its black sails were furled. Its long hulls were slick with tar. Its men crouched beneath the gunwales with their oilskins drawn close and their knives strapped crosswise against their hearts. The salt wind carried the resinous tang of pitch and the old iron scent of anchors long wet, and on the shore, where the cliff's chalk bones showed through scant grass, gulls circled with patient, priestly eyes. Euron Greyjoy's lips were bluish with the cold of the water. His hair hung in ropey strands, his beard braided with bits of driftwood, his gaze not on the men who watched him so hungrily, but on the tide's black tongue lapping the pebbled strand. He had drowned a boy into a man before the moon set, and the boy had come up sputtering and laughing and born again. The priest's voice, when it came, seemed to pour from the waves themselves, as though the sea had its hand in his chest and worked his lungs like bellows. "What is dead may never die," he intoned, "but rises again, harder and stronger." The black line of men along the shore answered as one, and the boom of it rolled over the anchored ships and across the sleeping water. Victarion Greyjoy, on the Iron Victory, felt it in his bones as he checked the binding on his helm's cheek plates and moved his shoulders against the weight of the kraken-engraved breast. His men were quiet. There was no need for talk. Words were for Greenlanders. The sea and steel would do the speaking. Beyond Victarion's prow, further out among the weaving blocks of fog that clung to the water like torn sailcloth, a darker shadow held itself very still. No pennant flew from its mast. No drum marked time under its deck. The silence did not need drums. The men aboard her had no tongues to shout with, and her master kept his own counsel. Euron Greyjoy stood at the prow, the crow's eye bright under the rim of his black iron cap, and watched where the fog thinned with a smile that did not reach his cheeks. "They'll think the mist is theirs," Victarion had told him the evening before, his voice a low rockslide rumble as the two brothers stood helmetless on the Iron Victory's quarterdeck and ate dried squid from a wooden bowl. "They'll think it hides them, and we'll feel for them by the tide. We'll hear their oars before they hear ours." Euron had laughed, a soft, indulgent sound, and tipped a dying coal from his pipe over the rail. "Stannis Baratheon thinks fog is a lesson in discipline," he'd said. "He'll cut it into neat squares and count them. What he cannot count he does not understand. Mentuinch." Now, with the day not yet begun and sea breath in his lungs, Victarion blessed his brother for that scorn. Stannis' royal fleet was coming up from the south and east, all clean-painted hulls with their stag banners tucked tight under their yards, and with them came vessels from the Reach and the Arbor, wine-fat and sure of their own skill. They would come in order, each captain proud of his rank, each ship obedient to horns and flags. The Iron Fleet would answer with the only things that mattered: tide, surprise, and the will of the drowned god. A wave rose and fell under the Iron Victory as if a great beast had turned in sleep beneath it. The ship sighed against her anchor rope. The men watched Victarion the way hunting dogs watch the hand that yet holds them. He put his helm on. When he spoke, the iron cheek plates made his voice seem to come from farther away. "Oars," he said. The men moved. They moved without chatter, without the shrill clatter of a gallant ship's deck. Leather thongs, beads of tar on the line, the creak of wet oaken thole-pins. They were sounds that had lived in the men's bones since boyhood. The oars slid out together, black ovals against the pale water, and the blades dipped and vanished. The Iron Victory sighed and turned, as a woman might turn in sleep toward warmth. Across the thin lanes of fog the same whispering was repeated. 30 longships, then 50, then more than 100, the fleet pulling itself into a long dark bow, the string drawn back and held. On the strand Euron Greyjoy knelt, cupped seawater in his hands, and let it stream back through his fingers. He kept his eyes closed while it ran away, and in his mind he saw the drowned halls, all pillars of bone-white coral and roofs of kelp, and the faces of the faithful who had molded their lungs into gills with prayer. When he lifted his head, the chill breeze combed his wet hair back from his face. He smiled as a man smiles in winter when he feels a hearth's heat begin to wake. And then he rose and went aboard the shoreboat waiting for him. And the shoreboat rose and fell, and was swallowed by the ships. A bell clanged to the west, faintly, the sound carried and torn by the fog. It was the tower bell of Seaguard, far beyond sight, a patient, stubborn sound that had mocked raiders for 100 years. To hear it now, here, with the shoals of Fair Isle beneath them, and the royal fleet knifing in from the east, was to remember every insult the green coast had ever offered, every prayer mocked by fat-bellied septons, every boy stolen young to be a dancing pet in some lord's hall. Victarion did not look toward the bell. He listened to the water. The tide had started to turn. He could feel it in his knees the way one feels a horse gather itself to leap. The narrow guts of water here ran north then west in a double tug, and the channels had teeth. Stannis Baratheon would know the charts and know where reefs lay, but he would not know the reefs as a man knows the pulse in his own throat. Victarion raised a hand. The steersman answered with a nod so small it might have been a twitch. No horns. No flags. The silence ghosted ahead and to seaward. A blot old as nightmares, her long beak cutting wake patterns like runes into the fog. Somewhere after the Iron Victory, Victarion knew the captains of the smaller ships were making the sign of the drowned hand and laying their oar grips across their knees, ready. They could move now as a school of fish turns. No man would have to think. Euron had said it was better when men didn't think. A dark wedge heaved itself out of the mist to starboard, close as a thrown net. For a heartbeat Victarion thought it a rock, then saw the pale strake-painted side and the green and white pennant drooping at the yard. A cutter from the arbor, scouting the channels, her deck crowded with men peering into the fog. One man raised his hand as if to speak. The Iron Victory had already come about. Her oars bit deep and drew. The prow shouldered silent water, a blade in meat. Victarion's shieldman barked once. Hooks went out black and hungry. The cutter's prow slewed. Men fell. The space between ships narrowed with a rope's scream. Victarion crossed like a man stepping from hearth to hearth within his own hall. His oarsmen flowed with him, small as sprites on that moment, and grew to giants as the first clash came. The arbor men wore bright mail, links clean as grapes in winter, and their helms were chased with vines, and they died the way vines do in frost. Victarion's axe chewed through a shoulder and bit the beam beneath it, stuck there like a dog come to bone. He leant into it and felt the wet crack inside his arm as something gave. Another man came, and he let go the axe and took a knife from his belt and slid it up, under, barked with the effort and the hard joy of it. When it was done, the deck remembered it had been made to walk on, and he walked. And the men behind him left a smear of red handprints on the vines. "Cast her off," he said, breath steady, and wiped his knife on a dead man's cloak. "Let her drift back down their line." A present. The cutter slewed again. Hooks pulled free. A shove, and the Iron Victory's oars drew. The wounded arbor boat lay in the tide, like a man who has taken his death wound, but has not yet heard it told to him. She turned slowly toward the sound of horns deeper in the fog. Victarion did not watch her go. Horns. He heard them now. One long, one short, then two long. The royal fleet telling itself a story, counting the squares of the fog as Euron had promised. The Iron Victory's oars dipped and rose. The men were humming under their breath now. The old war hum with no words, a thing their mothers had put into their bones as they lay to sleep with the taste of salt on their lips. The humming did not grow louder. It condensed, thickened, became an old companion's hand at the back of the neck. On the silence, Euron lifted one hand. A thin line of boats that had drifted all this while among the fog banks shuddered as if pulled by a hidden rope. They were fishermen's cots, old things, low to the water, with ragged sails patched 10 times and more. They had been captured 3 nights ago from villages along the little isles that ringed fair, and their fishermen had been given the peace of the deep by Erana's hand. Now the cots moved forward. A breath of wind from the north lifted their poor sails and made the patched places into eyes. Even so, they could not have moved so quick, save for the lines that trailed from each stern and vanished into the fog, lines that went down to barrels, and to pitch, and to oil, and to old wood and dry rope, that the drowned god would not miss. The silence did not blow a horn. Euron raised his hand higher, then brought it down as if he were conducting a prayer. Fire chose that moment to be born. It bloomed into the fog with a sound like a sighing breath. Slow at first, reluctant as a cold man rising from bed, then suddenly eager, quick, loving itself, licking at the mist as a cat licks its paws. The fishermen's cots became lanterns. Then they became 4 burning gates that drifted where the tide commanded, and behind them the fog turned the color of spoiled honey. Stannis Baratheon's fleet moved into that. Victarion could not see the fury, but he could see the pattern. The neat squares disrupted, the horns confused, one long called and another answered in panic. A ship loomed to larboard, broad and high, and full of archers whose bowstrings sagged in the damp. They loosed anyway. The arrows hissed. Some struck men who fell without a sound. Most struck water and stuck there, like thoughts that had not learned how to speak. The Iron Victory's oars drew and the ship leapt. She kissed the other's flank and loved it to splinters. Hooks bit, ropes shrieked, and Victarion went across, a rock thrown low and sure. By the time the fog tore itself into ragged banners and let the sun's first filaments in, the burning cots had drifted among the king's ships and had made the order into a stew. Victarion saw the fury at last, a great ship with the crowned stag bright at the fore, her man at the prow bareheaded and set like iron, her sides chewed by fire in 3 places, her men at the pumps and at the lines and at the weapons all at once. For a moment, something like admiration pried at Victarion's mouth, but it had no purchase. Euron was already slipping the silence toward her starboard quarter with a lover's stealth. Victarion chose the port. He shouted for the oars to bite, felt the Iron Victory's timber marrow shiver with the stroke, and the prow rose and smacked down in the fury's frothing wake. Archers turned. One arrow struck the curl of his helm and chimed like a little bell. Victarion laughed without sound and raised his shield. He hated archers. Archers made killing into accountancy. He wanted a face near enough to read. The Iron Victory slammed the fury with a shudder that leapt up men's legs and rattled their teeth. Ropes went, hooks found. The ships tried to push each other away and found themselves married. Victarion's shieldman took a quarrel in the thigh and sat down abruptly. His lips shaped mother. Victarion put his boot on the gunwale and went across. The gap was not a gap. It was the sea saying choose. He chose. The Fury's deck was a different country. Fast lines, taut as commands, the stink of fear hidden under clean oil, men whose mouths made neat oaths when they shouted their lord's name. Stannis Baratheon himself was there, not in king's colors but in lord's, a sword in his hand that had seen use and a jaw that had never taken a softer angle. Victarion saw him at once, the way a bull sees the dog that is not like the others. He barreled toward him, a man hewed his way between, a young knight perhaps, and Victarion's shield took the knight's blade, and turned it, and his axe took the knight's hope from the world in one red chop. He met Stannis at the pump station where the deck was slick with other men's trying. "You," Stannis said like a verdict. Victarion would remember later the way he'd said it, not as surprise, nor as hatred in the fashion of a Greenlander lord who thinks men are pieces, but as he might have named the sea when it rose to meet him. Stannis' sword had no beauty but the beauty of function. It came at Victarion in a hard silver line. Victarion met it with his axe haft, wood shivering under iron, and rammed his shield forward. Stannis stepped back. 2 men tried to take Victarion at his side. Victarion turned his head and spat, and the men flinched. Sea spit in their eyes. His oarsmen filled the stair behind him, hungry and singing now through their teeth. No horn. Still no horn from the silence, but a shadow fell on the Fury's starboard side, and men shouted and died a different way. Euron came lightly as a cat down from a rope whose anchor no one had seen placed, a smile like a knife that was too thin to be steel. Victarion did not look at him. The Fury's men were brave, but they were too many things at once. Pumpmen and fighters, rope tenders and husbands to a ship suddenly sick and burning. And the sea does not forgive men who try 2 labors with 1 breath. Stannis came on again, and this time he said nothing. His face had become smaller in that way of men who find the room they are in has shrunk to the size of their bodies. He cut at Victarion's arm. Victarion lifted and took the blow on the edge of his shield, felt the iron bite through to the meat. He grunted and felt the hurt as if it rose from the deck. Stannis pressed. Victarion, whose body was accustomed to the sea's push and pull, yielded a little, then stamped forward like a wave crossing a sandbar, and put his axe under Stannis' guard and into the place between plates at the hip. He felt the give. He smelled blood that did not smell of fish. For the first and last time that day, Stannis made a sound that was not command. It was not loud. It was a breath you might hear beside your own, on a night your love was dying. He did not drop his sword. He moved as if to turn, to find more space, and the deck denied him. Victarion brought the rim of his shield down hard on the side of Stannis' head. The Baratheon lord went to his knees like a strong tree given one cut too many. "Take him," Euron said suddenly beside Victarion, as if a thought had made him flesh. "Take him now." There were men whose hands would have shaken at the thought of laying hands on Stannis Baratheon. Ironborn hands did not shake. A net of arms fell over him. And when a man tried to make a last gift of his lord's life, Victarion took that gift from him with the axe beard and tossed it into the sea. The Fury shuddered as fire found something it loved below the waterline. The ship tried to move away from its marriage with the Iron Victory, and found that the desire had come too late. The silence loomed like nightfall. A scream went up, thin and high. A man tumbled past Victarion with his hair aflame. Euron's hand touched Victarion's elbow, a curious soft communion. Victarion shook it off as he might shake a crab from his boot. "Back," he said. "Bring him." They went back the way men go back through a storm, faces down, hands out, the world reduced to a set of sure old motions learned under a father's eye. Stannis did not struggle. He was not a man who made his pain into spectacle. Blood had turned one side of his face into a thing like a birthmark. His eyes were the same as they had been when he had first said "you." When they dragged him across to the Iron Victory, he did not look back at his ship. The Fury was a beast in its death throes now. Its flank torn, its men already small against the great orange mouths that opened to devour them. The fog that had been their ally became their winding sheet, folding close as the morning brightened within it, turning that brightness into a hot, ugly day. The Iron Fleet killed until killing had no new lessons to offer. The fireships sheared. The shoals remembered their faith and took their tithe. Oars beat until men's arms became ropes in truth. Their shoulders smoked, their throats closed. The tide swung, and those who had not learned it found themselves where no chart could help. When it was done, the sea was a field of blackened fruit, the crows already there before the trees had fallen. Aeron Greyjoy's hands were gentle when he washed Stannis wound with seawater. "What is dead may never die," he murmured, as if the words might soothe either of them. Stannis endured the touch. He did not answer prayers. He sat bound to the mainmast with his back straight and his eyes on the middle distance, as men do who have not yet decided which part of the day they will own. Victarion stood nearby and watched the horizon while Euron prowled, bored of blood so soon. Balon would want to know at once. Ravens, yes, and not only from iron ships, from the Crannog's coops on Fair Isle, from towers they had taken at night. Word would reach Pike before sundown. Word would reach Lannisport before the smoke did. Word would reach King's Landing like a gull that had flown day and night and somehow kept its strength. "What would you ask for him?" Euron asked at last, touching the thong at his wrist with idle fingers. "A king's brother who carries a king's pride like a stone. Will you sell him for iron? For gold? Or will you gift him back and ask for a promise signed in milk?" "Ben?" Victarion did not take his eyes from the ruined east. "I will do as the Lord Reaver commands." Euron's smile had knives hidden in it. "You always do." The sea's face changed as the day grew. Shook itself of fog, and put on a hard blue that showed all wounds without pity. The oarsmen cleaned their blades, and, when there was nothing else to do, cleaned them again. Some slept where they sat with their hands still holding rope, or haft. The silence slipped away before noon with a handful of chosen prizes, Euron too restless for waiting, the black sails of his ship, a poem that only he could read. Aeron prayed for the souls of the drowned, not to save them, but to welcome them to the halls where there is no hunger. He did not pray for Stannis. The man wore no god on his face. Perhaps he was his own. By evening, they were tacking north, the Iron Victory carrying a prize heavier than silver. The sea felt different after a battle, as if its skin had been scrubbed with sand. The men talked softly now, not of what they had done, but of the taste of a particular fish stew, of how a woman they remembered had laughed in a way that made a man fight better. One of them sang under his breath, a nonsense song about a goat that had swallowed 7 pearls and shat them out one by one. Victarion listened and did not listen. Duty sat on his shoulders like a patient child. On Pike the western wind had kicked all day at the bridges that ran between the islets, like the slings between a giant's fingers. The sea boomed against the cliff faces. The spray went up and came down like a valley's weather by itself. In the great hall where the sea-stone chair sat like a great fossil pried from the deep and dragged to this hearth's edge, Balon Greyjoy held himself as still as a pile of anchor chain and listened to ravens. There were 4 cages by the door, and 4 birds with eyes like old coins watched each man who entered as if tallying his value. Balon's hair had gone to iron and his face to old rope. He wore no crown. He needed the world to feel it and therefore did not put it on. Alanis Harlaw sat at the far end of the hall, on a long bench. She had not yet grown thin with grief. She was still the woman who had sat laughing against him on a spring night when their first son had been made. Her laughter had been a clean sound then, not this brittle thing it had become. She watched Balon and not the door. Her hands lay quiet in her lap, and she kept one thumb stroking the other, as if calming a small creature that lived there. Asha Greyjoy. No one called her anything but Asha in those days. Stood behind her mother with her wrists crossed and the heel of one boot tapping in silence against the rushes. She was a tall girl whose bones seemed to have decided early they would not take orders from anyone else. Salt had whitened her hair in odd places even now, when she was only just flowered, and she had stolen a pair of knives from her uncle's chest and kept them until he had found better to give her. She did not look at the ravens. She looked at the window slit that faced west and measured the time by the light on the water. Theon was all knees and hands. He had that look boys do when their limbs have outgrown their sense of where to end. His hair fell into his eyes. He had kept a crab as a pet for 3 days, and buried it when it died, and was not ashamed to have cried then. He had watched men drown and not cried since. He stood as close to the hall's door as he could without being sent from the room, and when a man brought a letter, he watched the man's mouth as if it might deliver words before the raven did. When the 3rd messenger came, the one whose face was blackened at the edges, as if smoke had tried to claim him and had been denied, men moved without knowing they had moved. He took a knee at the foot of the dais and held out a cylinder of wood wrapped in damp sailcloth. A salt crust had formed where the cloth had dried. When Balon did not reach, Asha stepped forward and took the thing. She felt the roughness of the old sail with the pads of her fingers, the wet cold of the wood. Then she unbound it and tapped free a small roll of vellum. Her fingers had tar along the bent knuckles. It left faint crescent moons on the pale skin of the parchment. "Say it," Balon said, no louder than wind at a window. Asha read. Her voice had learned a woman's depth before her face had. "The royal fleet has been scattered and burnt off Fair Isle," she said. "The Fury is taken. Lord Stannis Baratheon is our prisoner aboard the Iron Victory. Euron has taken 3 prizes of note and a dozen smaller. The silence pursues stragglers. The drowned priest Aeron says the drowned god has answered. Victarion awaits command." "Nah." The words did not echo. The hall seemed to hold them closely and privately, as if unwilling to let them stray where they might be sullied by grease or foolishness. There was a place in every man of Pike where those words landed and made their own bed. Some men looked to the sea-stone chair as if expecting it to speak. Some looked at the floor and dreamt of gold rings. Theon looked at his father and saw that Balon, who moved less than other men even when he moved, did not move at all. "I will not be a lord rebelling," Balon said at last. "I will be a king who is. Send to Harlaw, to Old Wick, to Great Wick, to Black Tide." Send to Lord's good brother, to Botley. Send to Grey Garden and to Orkmont. Tell them to come to Pike and to come now. Bring me quills and a writing board." Alanis turned her face slightly, enough to show one cheekbone's clean line in the hearthlight. "You will ask for terms," she said, not quite a question. "I will give them terms," Balon answered. "We keep what we can hold. We have cut the arm they raised to strike. If the head does not learn, we cut again. But a wise king does not fight a war he has already won. I will take their words and show them the sea's words beside them until they read correctly." "What will you ask?" Asha asked, the question like a dart, thrown without fear. Balon's mouth made the shape of a smile, and did not complete it. "Fealty? From us? No, Dao. The Greenlands teach us nothing, and we do not kneel. They will acknowledge the freedom of the Iron Isles, and they will acknowledge our rule from Fair Isle to the Cape of Eagles, where our men can land from water before they can ride from land. They will pay in grain and iron for the ships they have lost. We will return their lord whole, if he has the wisdom to be so. And we will take a promise from their king, that he will not poison the sea with his fleets again." Besimhro. "The red wines," a man near the back said, respectful but not afraid to speak in his lord's hall. "The Arbor fleet." "Let them come," Balon said. The same way he might have said, "Let the tide turn." "Let them come as their wine allows. We will take their hulls and drink their taste when we piss into their bilges. They are soft men with soft hands. Their ropes were never mended with their teeth." Bah! Theon loved his father then with a child's sudden fierceness, his chest too small for his heart. He had wrapped his tongue around those prayers of Aranaz and made them his own. He had bled from hands and knees on rocks older than gods, and to hear his father speak as if the sea itself had chosen his throat, as its instrument was to feel the world set itself to a true course. He looked at Asha and saw her watching Balon with that sharp, bright look she had when she threw knives at the driftwood post behind the kitchens. Later he would remember how the knives always landed true when she looked like that. Balon wrote letters, his hand surprising in its neatness. Letters to the Red Keep, to the Warden of the North, to the Lords of the Riverlands, to Casterly Rock. He did not bejewel them with threats. He did not hang them with insults. He was as plain as the sea against a cliff. He offered simple things, a name for what they had just seen, a shape for what would come next, if men pretended not to know the name. He ordered also that a raven be sent with a different letter on different wings, one that bore no seal and no courtesy, one that would find John Arryn where he coupled prudence with law and made a marriage of it. To Stannis on the Iron Victory, Victarion gave clean bandages and a corner of shade and water from a skin that had not seen the inside of a barrel with wine in it. Stannis took those like a man receiving bread at a common table, and owed no thanks. "You mean to ransom me," he said when the light had slanted to late afternoon, and the heat of the day mellowed, and lay like a weight across the back rather than a whip. "You mean to live," Victarion answered. "You're worth something alive to your kin, and less than that dead to the sea." Stannis' mouth tightened that fraction that said he had understood a thing which he would remember long after this conversation. "Your brother," he said. "The one with black sails. Euron. He plays at war as other men play at dice, and he enjoys his luck," Stannis said, "not as praise. Men who live by luck are often pleased to eat their own pride for the taste of it. Your other brother wears religion as a man wears a chain shirt, every movement a proof of its weight. And you," he stopped. He was not a man given to flattery. "You are loyal to an idea of yourselves." Victarion grunted. "We are the sea's people. That is an idea old as bone. You came to our halls with fire. We showed you what the sea thinks of fire. Menshau. I came because my king commands and because law without strength is a lie," Stannis said, as if quoting a catechism. He looked beyond Victarion to the low line of the horizon. "Your king is a lord with an old chair and a new ambition." Victarion turned his head a little and spat. "You will have his answer soon enough." It rained that night, softly at first, as if the sky were a woman patting a child's hair dry. Then with the sudden earnestness that comes when clouds remember their purpose. The water ran through the rigging with a sound like fingers combing string. Men tilted their faces up to it to wash smoke from their skin and ghosts from their eyes. The rain hissed where it found embers and ash floating still. The sea took it all without remark. On the morrow, the silence returned with prizes. A broad-beamed trader, showing the arms of Case painted on her stern. A swan-necked arbor galley, whose deckhands had hands like kitchen maids. And a royal cutter with tattered purple pennant that had come apart under Euron's laughter. He walked Stannis' deck once without invitation and stood an arm's length away, smiling a small smile that promised he kept better smiles for when he was alone. Stannis looked through him. Men who had held swords point forward all day and had come to sleep in a dry place watched them both with the same expression. The one men wear when the world is working too hard to entertain them and they do not trust it. The Iron Fleet gathered itself in a long black curve and turned for home. The voyage to Pike always smells like returning to yourself and like the warning of rocks. The iron smell is in the water there. A low iron. An old iron. Not the quick bright scent of a new nail but the taste of the chain that tethered the first ship ever made. Aeron stood in the bow with his arms lifted as if to embrace the isle. He was not a man who thought of victory as a personal favor to him. Victory belonged to the drowned god who had let these men borrow it for a day. He murmured the names of the drowned to the air as the islands rose from the slate water. To a priest, each name was a coin put back into the right purse. On the cliffs, women had been watching the sea since dawn. Men who had stayed home kept busy with stone and rope, so their hands would not betray what their hearts did. Children ran and stopped and ran again, and did not know why the breath in their throats felt like a net. When the first hulls showed, men shouted out names of ships like they were the names of lovers seen in a crowd. And when the Iron Victory's prow shouldered the first of the standing comers and climbed it and fell, the sound the shore made was not quite cheering, and not quite the sound a ship makes when it finds the harbor by night. It was both. Theon got there before the others, because he had been awake before the sun and had gone by the old path the cliff goats made, a path that would make a Greenlander weep. He was a boy with hands and knees like stones that had learned to climb, and so he came to the ledge above the landing and could see down without being seen. He saw his uncle Aeron in the prow and whispered the prayer because he did not think the prayer was useless show. He thought it was like the sound the sea made when it knew your name. He saw the silence behind the Iron Victory and did not whisper any prayer at all. Euron made him think of nights when the wind turned and came from the direction of a place no one taught you about. They brought Stannis ashore under guard, but without cruelty. Some men wanted to throw stones because stones were easiest to find, and the old anger in them wanted any action, even if it were dull. The guards did not permit it. A man who cannot hold himself when power sits on him will not hold his ship in weather. Asha watched the procession with her arms folded and her posture easy, like a woman at the quay who has already counted her coins and knows none will be missing. She caught Victarion's eye and lifted an eyebrow. He inclined his head. Theon watched Stannis go past and held his breath. He would remember that face long after he forgot the rope-laid pattern of the cloak the man wore. A face like a dock pilaster, carved not for beauty but for use. A face that had not found the world to its taste and had sneered at the world, and then swallowed the sneer and called it duty. In the great hall, Balon was already seated. The seastone chair made the men who came to it remove some part of themselves. Men had written poems about that chair's oldness, and others had tried to guess whether it had been carved by men or by the sea's patient devotions. None of that mattered when you stood before it. What mattered was that the man who sat upon it looked like a piece of it until he spoke, and then he looked like the reason it had been made. Stannis Baratheon was brought to stand where thieves are brought, and where envoys stand also. It is a cruel convenience of halls that those places are the same distance from the Lord's feet. He did not attempt to bow. The iron-bound stick that had been tied to his forearm to keep his wound from opening again gave a little snap as the weight of his body shifted. But he made no sound. He looked at Balon Greyjoy the way Victarion had seen him look at the deck when it had shuddered under him, as if measuring which parts would break and which would hold. "You would speak," Balon said, his voice level. "I would not bandy dignity with men who take tongues for sport," Stannis said, as if Euron personally had addressed him, and no one else existed. His eyes moved to Aeron and then away as if from a furnace. "But I will hear your terms, and I will carry them, if I live, to my brother who wears the crown." and I will give you mine. Ben? This hall is full of men who made their own tongues with the sea's leave, Aeron said, a mildness in him more dangerous than anger. Speak your small god's words. Stannis' mouth flattened. You have won a battle, he said to Balon. You have won it with tricks and with the sea's treachery. You have destroyed ships that cost more than the worth of your halls and the hovels that cluster around them. You have taken me. You have not won a war. The Reach will wake. The Arbor will find its stones. The Lannisters of Casterly Rock will pour gold into shipwrights' hands until the smell of pitch is stronger than the smell of wine in Lannisport. The North will build. Lord Eddard Stark will find men who have not forgotten how to shape a keel. The Riverlands will bar their doors and ring their bells and starve you of targets. The king, my brother, will come or he will send. If he sends, you will be worn down. If he comes, you will be crushed. There were some men in the hall who would have shouted then, if Balon had not been sitting. Asha smiled without mirth. Victarion scratched the scar along the back of his hand as if remembering how it had come there. You have the voice of honest stone, Balon said when Stannis had finished. And the mind that suits it. We have thought of all these things. We have thought of them while we have mended our nets in the wind and taught our boys to swim in cold water, while your men have argued the names of new dishes at their court tables. We do not mean to be worn down. We mean to stand where we are, and we mean to stand with a knife in each hand, and to move quick when a foot slips. Your ships can be remade. Our seas cannot be unlearned. Bah. You ask me to carry your threats, Stannis said. No, Balon answered. I will send my threats on black wings. I ask you to carry a truth. You will go to King's Landing under guard and under flag. You will tell the king that the Greyjoys of Pike have taken his brother with steel and surf, and that we will return him uncrippled and uninsulted, if the king will say the words we require. We will not kneel, an old thing for us. We will be kings of what has always been ours to be kings of. And in return, we will take his oath that he will not send fleets to drown themselves on our shores. He will pay a reckoning for the ships taken. He will send grain. We will send him his brother unbroken if he agrees, and we will keep him alive and unmolested until he answers. Then now. And if he refuses? Stannis asked. Balon's hands lay on the sea-stone chair's arms as if they had been carved with it. You know as well as I the worth of a brother to a king. There was a pause then in which a boy's breath could be heard, and that boy was Theon, and he would remember the sound he had made, that high, controlled thread of a sound, the rest of his life. He would remember it in places inland, where there was no sea at all, when men wore furs for the cold of winter, and the smoke of their chimneys made night where day belonged. At last, Stannis said, I will not be a coin you spend twice. That is not my intention, Balon said. I will spend you once, and I will get my money's worth. Aeron closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them the color of them seemed to have deepened. He will go with the prayer, the priest said. The sea will hear him, and hear the oath that comes from that southern throne, if an oath comes. If an oath does not come, the sea will take back what it lent to us by reminding itself of justice. Then Euron leaned against a pillar and tapped the wood with a fingertip. Theon had not seen him come in. Euron was like that. He wore a patch today, and fine leather boots, and a ring he had not had yesterday. And if the king sends the Red Wine fleet, he said lazily, if he sends a fleet commanded by the Wine Lord's fat sons and the Queen's golden father's golden captains, if he sends a fleet commanded by Pride and Plenty, so heavy with both it can hardly even float, then we will feed the sea well, Balon said. Victarion escorted Stannis to his quarters, well guarded, not mean. On the way, a girl crossed their path carrying a basket of dried cod. She had hair pale as spun rope and eyes like the sky when storms had not yet chosen where to be born. She glanced at Stannis and then looked away, the way women do when they have learned not to be caught looking at strange men. Stannis watched her go, and his jaw clenched and released. Victarion wondered if the man had ever been young, or if he had been born at that age and had become harder and thinner in all ways but number. A day later, with the sky a clean blue bowl, and the horizon so sharp you could cut rope on it, 2 ravens left Pike. one to the rock, and one to the Red Keep. A third flew north with a letter for Winterfell that did not speak of victory so much as it spoke a courtesy older than kings. There are manners among wolves and among krakens both. Balon did not want to make Eddard Stark his enemy until time had made it necessary. Stannis Baratheon sailed the next morning under a white flag sewn by a woman whose hands had made more nets than banners. Victarion went with him. Euron did not. Aeron blessed the waves and anointed Stannis' brow with seawater. Stannis did not flinch, but his eyes, for a heartbeat, were not in his skull, but somewhere no prayer could reach, and Victarion marked it as a sailor marks a light he may later need. When the Iron Victory cleared the headlands and Pike fell away astern in a low bristle of towers, Theon climbed the cliff path until his lungs burned. He wanted to see the ship grow small, the way a pebble thrown grows small in long grass, and he wanted to imagine himself aboard her, among men who had bled, that he might be proud. He did not know that a raven, wing-weary and ash-dusted, was arriving at the Red Keep at that same hour to be taken by a boy whose hands smelled of parchment and fear to a hand whose nails were kept clean by habit, not vanity. He did not know that a second raven would find Casterly Rock overbright and be frightened by the shine of it and beat its wings harder, or that a third would startle a direwolf in the cold court of a northern castle and be spared only because a girl had lifted her hand and raised a wrist for the bird to perch on and said softly, "Gentle?" Gentle now. Bah. He knew only the shape of the horizon and the sound the sea makes when a small ship meets a wave and climbs it and for a moment is held on the wave's shoulder as if for a portrait. King Robert Baratheon would rage when he read the letter, but he would keep his rage under the old boar hunter's sense that slamming into thicket may end with your guts on a tusk. Jon Arryn would counsel a word, a promise, the buying of time, grain for a season, oaths like fish scaled and laid in rows, the better to choose among them. Tywin Lannister would hold the letter as if it were an account book, and see lines unbalanced and think of weight and leverage and the long memory of the rock. Eddard Stark would read and stand very still until the ink dried, then order that timbers be cut in woods where the ground held water and old roots, and he would think of Theon Greyjoy only in the way a man thinks of a river he may one day have to cross. The Redwynes would sit with maps and argue what the wind owed them by custom. The river lords would ring their bells and curse the sea that had never been theirs. The church would pray. The small folk along the western shore would count jars and hope the winter would be a mild one and not so hungry. The seals would swim regardless. The fish would turn on their sides where sunlight fell and show their white. On Pike, Asha went to the strand with a long knife and her hair braided back, and she taught Theon how to gut a fish clean and fast and not to waste the sweet belly meat. He grinned at her and got blood on his face, and did not see her mouth soften in a way it did not for other people. She was a hard girl, and loved him with the hard love of rocks, for things that also take the weather without complaint. Aeron walked the waterline and talked to the crabs as if they were congregants, and listened to what the weeds had to say when the tide went out. Euron climbed a tower no one else climbed, and looked west with a spyglass, as if he had it in mind to see all the way to other worlds. Balon wrote another letter, and then another, meeting paper with patience, writing not as a man laying snares, but as a man setting stones in a wall. He means to stand through storms his grandchildren have not names for. Victarion watched the coastline slide by, and kept his men to their work and their cups to their mouths, only when permitted. He let Stannis stand on the quarterdeck for an hour each day to look at the sea. It was a kind of courtesy. The man did not once ask for more. They anchored off Dragonstone when the light was a copper coin on the water, and the island's old crouching beasts watched them with their weather-spalled eyes. Dragonstone had a smell older than pitch. It stank of the past, of old fires, old faiths, old bones made into new things. Stannis stood with blood brown and dry in the crease of his ear, where the healer's cloth had not reached, and lifted his chin by a finger's breadth. "My brother is at the Red Keep," he said. "He will send men to meet us here and finish the journey. I will not run. If I wished to run, I would have found the place for it." "Then?" Victarion shrugged. "If you ran, you would drown. Men who run from oaths usually do." "If I drowned," Stannis said, "I would not be troubled any longer by men who let their brother poison the law and then pretend a god approves. Victarion was not a man for the politics of other men's beds. He said nothing. They waited 2 days on the lee side of Dragonstone, and the wind had one voice the whole time. Victarion began to be angry with it for its sameness. On the 3rd day the royal cutter came, clean and quick, her captain nervous and stiff as if he had a sword inside him that had not yet learned to bend. There was form to it, documents, seals. A tight conversation between men who measured words like weight. Stannis did not beg or bargain. He stepped from one deck to the other, as a man steps across a pale line on a floor, and knows the room beyond contains obligations he will not enjoy, and enters it anyway. Victarion watched him go, and he knew the day's taste before it had come into his mouth. It would taste of iron and of waiting, and beneath those, something like rust on old chains. The long patience of a war that had decided to take its time. On the return to Pike, the sea changed its voice. A line of storm clouds crept up from the southwest with the caution of robber cats. The sky turned the color of lead held in hands too long. The first rain came as a whispered conference and then rose to argument. The Iron Victory took it as she took all weather, with the patient animal acceptance of a creature that knows the world is larger than it, and that it will outlive most of the world's moods. The men hunkered and did their work and stole warmth in inches. Victarion felt the ship's every breath through the soles of his feet, and was content. He had been made for this kind of living, made of it, as if the sea had turned him on a lathe. They brought their account to Balon, and found him already paying new debts he had chosen himself. Men had been sent to retake Fair Isle, and not merely to sack it. A warden from among their own would keep its beacons, and teach the islanders to ring theirs for ironborn purposes. On Orkmont a new shipyard had sprung up. No Galler's Folly, but low smart, like a ferret's burrow, full of brushwood to hide the smell of pitch from watching ships. In the quiet of nights when the wind walked the bridges and made several songs out of its one voice, messengers came with news that Lannisport had laid out new slips, that Casey was building, that Old Town had written to the Arbor about obligations, and the Redwine Lord had answered with a letter longer than a man's arm and twice as proud. A raven from the Red Keep came with the king's answer. The wax bore a stag and a crown, both smudged by the hand that had pressed them. The letter's words were plainly John Arryn's, and the rage between them was plainly Robert's. They would recognize the Greyjoy's right to rule the Iron Isles as a separate kingdom, and would send grain in measured amounts for 2 years, and there would be no blockade. In return, the Ironborn would return Stannis Baratheon whole, and swear to raid no farther than the lines named. A map was attached. There were lines like fishing lines drawn on it, from the tip of the Westerlands to the Cape of Eagles, from there to a place on the coast of the Reach, marked with a careful little note about shoals, and the Shield Islands were mentioned in terms a man could read 2 ways if he had a taste for cleverness. There were other stipulations: prisoners to be returned for ransom, not kept for sport, a halt to the burning of merchant hulls that flew certain marks. Balon read the letter, and then he read it again in silence. He walked the length of the hall once, and then sat and wrote an answer that was not so long as the first, and perhaps sharper for that. When he was finished, he looked up, and the look was the one Asha loved to see, the look of a man standing on the cliff where the wind makes choices and choosing with it. "They will not keep these lines," he said. "Lines move. Men move them. We will take what is ours when we will, and when they complain we will show them their own words and the sea behind them. Bring Stannis home." Nan. Victarion brought him home to Dragonstone, and handed him to men who watched him like a solution to a riddle, and could not bring themselves to say thank you. Stannis did not say thank you either. He had put his gratitude and his anger in the same chest, and closed the lid. He walked up the dragon steps with his jaw set, and did not turn back. Victarion turned his ship's nose into the wind, and did not look back either. There are men to whom looking back is the same as falling. With that done, the sea drew breath. Asha took 2 ships and raided Greenstone, not for cruelty but for practice, and for the worth of their speed. She brought back grain in sacks, and a boy who had fallen in love with her while trying to kill her, and whom she shook off like a burr from a cloak, laughing. Euron took the Silence west, and returned with a Myrish lens and a story about a storm that no one believed and yet repeated. Aeron baptized 3 men who had survived the Fair Isle fight by hiding under planks and had woken to their shame. Theon watched all of this and learned to grip an oar with hands that wouldn't blister, learned to put a knife into a pig and not into himself, learned to look at a chart and see tide in the lines. Far off, storms were gathering like uninvited kin at a wedding where wine was free and the bride was pretty. Tywin Lannister sent gold to shipwrights and expected respect in return. The Reach went to its great wine cellars of men and took out strong vintages and rolled them toward the sea. Lord Jason Mallister polished Seaguard's bell and rang it at odd hours, because the bell did not know how to laugh, and someone must teach it caution instead. Lord Eddard Stark spoke with men who were older than he, and listened to the way they described Akil's stubbornness and Winter's patience. Robert Baratheon drank and hunted and burst out laughing at the wrong moments, and was silent at the right ones, and Jon Arryn marked those moments in his mind, the way a careful banker marks the days of fruitful trade, and the days when the river runs too high. On a day that began like any other, an old fisherman in a round-bellied boat off the coast of the crag saw the sea's skin change, as if something immense had passed under it, a whale or a god's hand. Then saw, by the white of their wakes, a dozen longships sliding with a kind of tender hunger toward the river mouth there. He watched them go, and said a prayer to a god who had not been close enough to catch him when his wife had died. And then he said another prayer he had learned as a boy from a woman who had laughed at priests. He cast his line and a fat fish took it, and he was grateful to someone, though he did not know who. On that same day, Theon stole away from Asha's eyes and went to the southern bridge alone. The wind walked there without accompaniment. The drops of old salt in the ropes and the planks had learned to belong to the island, and so they gleamed without shame. He set one foot after another, and shivered, and did not know whether it was fear or delight. He reached the middle and stood with his hands fisted on the rope, and the sea far below him made a sound like a great animal asleep and dreaming. He thought of his father as the sea's voice, and of his uncle Aeron as the sea's law, and of his uncle Euron as the sea's joke that no one else understood. He thought of Victarion as a ship made into a man. He thought of himself as something that had not yet chosen what part of the sea it would be. "What are you doing, little cod?" Asha said from behind him, easy as if she had been leaning there all day, and had not just walked with a Graceman fell in love with. He did not turn. Listening. To what? He didn't have a word that would not sound foolish. To how it will all be. Asha came to stand beside him, and the bridge rocked. And they did not. "The sea will be as it was," she said. "We will make names for parts of it, and pretend those names last. But Balon has pulled a knife on a feast day, and gotten away with it. And there will be other days and other knives. Keep your feet. When the wind jumps, lean with it. That is all any of us can do." "Ben Namansha." He nodded. He did not know that far away, a red priest was stoking a new fire in a place where even dragons knew to step carefully, or that in a modest room in King's Landing a letter from Pike lay weighted with a cup because the window would not close properly, or that a woman in the Riverlands was teaching her son to pull a bowstring back to the corner of his mouth and not to his ear. He knew the rope under his fingers and the taste of salt, and the particular way the light fell on the slopes of Pike at that hour, and made old stones look new for a few breaths. And he knew that Asha's voice made him braver than he would have been without it. When he and Asha came back to the hall, the men were gathered again, and a map had been dragged out and weighted at the corners with stones that had been warmed by the fire and smelled faintly of old kelp. Balon stood with his hands behind his back, the way a captain stands who lets his ship tell him what it wishes to do before he tells it what it will do. Victarion's thick fingers smoothed one edge of the parchment, a gesture gentler than anything else about him. Euron had drawn on the map, lightly, lines in watered ink that suggested currents the parchment had not known to show. Aeron stood a little apart and watched with a gaze like a surf that never stopped folding and unfolding. "We hold this," Balon said, touching a span of coast that was all coves and cold water and poor farms whose people were too used to winds to fear them. "We can strike here, here and here. We can take a little and say we meant only to take that. We can take more later and say their maps were old. We can make the red wines pay for each barrel's passage, twice. Then? You cannot hold the Shield Islands and fight the Reach at the same time, Victorian said with a bluntness that was a kind of love. We need deeper harbors closer to home. We need to make the Greenlands come to us if they want to fight, not go to them with our ribs bared to their arrows. We will not be so hungry this winter, Asha said, reading the grain marks with a thrifty woman's eye. The price they pay will be paid in bread. Let them count coins. We will count loaves. Euron smiled. The best part of my joke, he murmured, is that men keep laughing when I am finished. Aaron spoke then, softly, and men leaned in without realizing they had done it. The drowned god has given us a sign in Stannis' taking, and in his returning. He is a hard god, and he does not always bother with signs when he can simply drown. But he has spoken with this, and he says this: do not think of crowns. Think of the sea. The sea is our crown. The crowns of men are paper, folded and painted. The sea is a rock, and a grave, and a cradle. Wear that. Then? Balon turned his head and his eyes showed their iron then. We will wear it, he said. We will wear it so long no one will remember a time when we did not. Outside the hall, the wind made one more slow pass along the bridges, and down the cliffs and across the water, as if to taste what had been said, and then it moved out to sea to tell it. The sea listened without comment. It had been told many things, and had kept some, and let others wash away. At night, Theon lay on his pallet, and watched the shadows from the hearth fire finger the beams above him. He saw ships in those shadows, and men, and a stag's head with blood dried dark in its ear, and his sister's knife catching light like a little piece of sea on a summer day. He did not know whose face it was that looked at him from the shadow at the corner, a face old and salt-streaked and humorless and patient. He did not know that he was imagining himself. He turned onto his side and tucked his hand under his cheek, and listened to the sea breathing, and to men snoring through the walls, and to the soft hiss as something, perhaps a rat, perhaps his future, moved behind the stones, and he slept and dreamed of drowning and of rising again, harder and stronger. In the weeks that followed, the Iron Fleet learned restraint as a new art. Men who had counted success by the brightness of a burning quay learned to measure it by the quiet when a merchant captain turned his head and pretended not to see the black sail 2 coves over. Theon learned to stand on a deck that had come near to being empty of boards, and to adjust his stance as if he were a nail being driven into that wood. Asha took him on 2 short raids and let him steer for an hour when the water was kind, and he came back with hands so blistered he could not hold a bowl, and a grin he could not keep off his face. Aeron drowned a man who had murdered another for a ring, and brought him back and made him confess, and watched him die a second time more quietly. Euron went away and came back with a Valyrian trinket, and a way of looking at the wind that made men's sentries shiver even in sun. Ravens came and went. One brought a letter from Lord Eddard Stark, spare in words and full in courtesy, acknowledging that raiding newly indefended places would court a kind of war neither of them wished, naming rivers as lines not merely on maps, but in men's minds, saying that the North would not burn hards along the lonely light if the Isles did not set torches to White Harbor's cranes. Balon read it twice and then laughed, a short, pleased sound. He sent a cask of salt fish back with a letter no longer than a knife blade that said yes in the old way, and said no in the new way, and would make good reading beside a river if it were not for the wind. Tywin Lannister's answer to the first letter had been a thing like a ledger dressed in finery. No and no again, and a long memory, and a promise that their gold would find iron workmen with harder arms than a kraken's and build ships with ribs like grudges. Balon posted that on the hall's door, and men came in and out and spat on it without malice, as a man spits on a good whetstone to wet it. Later a second letter came from a lesser Lannister, one whose signature had a flourish, and had asked for ransom terms for 3 men of name. Balon wrote those terms out in a hand steady as the tides, and sent them, and was paid, and said nothing celebratory when the coin came. Only had it weighed and measured and melted and made into bars that would bend into nails in time. From King's Landing came further letters that bore Jon Arryn's neat patience overflown with the king's great blunt laugh between the lines. Grain arrived. Not as much as the letter named, but enough that women on Pike cleaned their bowls with fingers and said one word of thanks before they scolded their children for dropping crumbs. A royal envoy came also, gray and well-traveled, with eyes that looked at the sea as one looks at a friend who keeps secrets. He sat with Balon and Asha and Victarion, and drank beer not wine, and asked questions that showed he had understood almost everything except the one thing that could not be taught: that the sea had voices, and some men heard them. The king would have you send a delegation to swear the articles in the Red Keep, the envoy said. It is a matter of form. He has agreed to yours. He would have you agree to his in a place that lets him show he is king. The sea is my place, Balon answered. I will not kneel in a hall. I will stand on a deck, and I will not kneel there either. I will meet him on the black water in a ship anchored in the mouth of the river, and we will each step aboard that ship and say our words and step back again. It will be a good lesson for him. It will be a humiliation, the envoy said, not unkindly. It will be wisdom, Aaron corrected gently. All men should be reminded where their halls end. The envoy was a brave man, or a competent one, which is often the same thing. He pressed once more and then yielded, and he took Balon's reply to the king and told his oarsmen on the way back to say prayers to any god that would hear. In due time, Robert sent word that he would meet on the water under a clean sky, with 100 men watching, and twice 100 thinking they were not seen. Such a meeting would echo down corridors long and cold, and through the small rooms where plans are sharpened on whetstones made of rumor. The lines on the old maps would be pressed deeper. The names of coasts and coves would be said differently at tables where salt was cheap. And if, sometimes, on still nights, when the sea lay like lead, and the moon's path was a king's road cut, and paved for its sole use, Balon Greyjoy rose from his bed and went to stand on the bridge and feel it move under him. And if he put his palm on the rope and felt the old age in it, and if something in him knew back, he did not show it to anyone, not a rock. He did not show it to anyone, not. He kept that knowledge as a man keeps a knife under his pillow, not for use every night, but for the night when the raid comes to his own door. He watched the way Asha laughed with her men, and the way Victarion's grim mouth softened when a child tumbled against his boot, and the way Aronah's eyes took on a shine that had nothing to do with light when he spoke his god's name. And he thought of Theon's thin wrists, and the day they would be thicker, and he thought of Theon's head, and the look on Stannis Baratheon's face, when he had been told some part of his law had broken off and flighted beyond his reach for a whale. Okay. Dawn came gray, like cloth worn thin by salt and time. And the sea lay close to Pike, as if it had crept in the night to listen at the doors. Nets dripped along the strand, oars leaned in racks with their blades turned down, like monks' faces. A gull dropped to the water and rose with a little silver writhe in its beak, and the fish shone once before it was a part of the bird. The wind walked the bridges and kept its counsel. Balon Greyjoy broke his fast with barley bread and dried herring and did not taste either. The table was clean plank without ornament. The knife at his right hand was from his father's belt, and still held a nick from a night on Old Wick, when a man who thought himself brave had tried to learn about ironborn bravery with a blunt club. Alanis sat to his left, small-boned, a woman who had learned to keep her grief in the hollows of her collarbones, when it was not welcome at the table. She wiped Theon's mouth with the back of her fingers when he forgot himself and smiled at him with her eyes, and returned to the work of counting the days without saying it aloud. Asha came and went as if a breeze took her. Victarion ate like a man whose body had learned how much food it needed in storms, and would be cheated neither by peace nor war. Aaron chewed slowly, as if tasting the sea's moods in the fish, and after he swallowed, he touched 2 fingers to the rim of the bowl, and murmured a thing that was half a prayer and half a promise. Euron did not come to breakfast. He rarely came when the day smelled of business. They would sail south to the mouth of the Blackwater that day or the next, to meet a king on water under sky, with no roof between. The letters had flown. The agreements had been made in neat hands and soft wax. The ships were tarred. The long hulls sat lightly in the green. It would be a day of forms, which Balon did not despise. Forms were a kind of harness you could put on a moment before you rode it. Men who pretended to hate forms usually had no seat when the moment bucked. "Do not bring the silence," Alani said quietly, crumbling the crust of her bread and not looking at him. "It is a bad luck ship at a parley." Balon lifted his gaze from the knife. "Bad luck lives on men," he said. "Ships only learn it." "Ships remember better than men," Alani said. "And let that be all." He took the Iron Victory and two smaller longships with low, clever lines that would make little wake, and a round-bellied trader from Harlaw whose hold could take casks of grain if the king kept his word to the letter and not merely to the air. Asha asked for a place, and got it because she took places like water takes rock, by the simple old method of being what it is. Theon watched her lash down a chest in the trader's stern and asked silent questions with his shoulders. She laughed, knotted the line faster, then pressed his hand once against the taut hemp to teach him what right felt like. Euron watched them go from the seaward tower, his patch a bruise of color against the day. He did not wave. His smile was the small one with knives laid like fish bones inside it, the one that made boys turn suddenly and take the long path to the quay, and the more dangerous one to safety. When the hull slid wide of the last teeth of pike and found the deeper swells, he went down the stair into a room where 3 lenses lay in a row, and a book sat open like a wound, and he closed the book and hummed a song that has no words, only wind. The river's mouth wore its crown of towers and walls and old mud with a careless old queen's dignity. In the distance, King's Landing lay along its hill like a dog who had learned to go no farther than its chain allowed and had made a bed of the dust under it. Smoke rose from a dozen places and had the particular palace smell of fat burned for pleasure. The sea breathed in and out of the black water, and the river tried to say it had a will of its own and failed politely. The neutral ship was a deep-keeled Myrish build, hired with coin and a particular promise about who could set foot on its deck and when. Her rail bore carvings of fish with human hands. She rode the swell as if taking the sea's pulse and finding it satisfactory. The Iron Victory came up on her starboard quarter with room to turn if the wind thought itself clever. The trader loafed beyond, oars shipped and crew lounging, as if their interest was in the weather and not in kings or coins. On the far side, a royal galley lay too prettily at anchor, its paint too fresh for sea, the stag bright at its fore, and a banner whose gold thread showed work done by the hands of women who had never bled at the fingers for rope. Robert Baratheon came across first, because it was his habit to come first to any table, whether for bread or for blood. He was bigger than Balon remembered from the years when men's meetings had been at sword's length, thicker through the chest and rounder at the jaw. But the movement under it was the same. The bull that has not forgotten the joy of the charge, only learned to eat more between them. He walked as if he had always had the right to walk there, which is a king's trick easier learnt by some than others. Jon Arryn was with him, pale eyes under pale brows, neat as a clerk who has discovered that neatness is a form of iron. Stannis came too, thinner, with the mark on his temple a healed shadow, his mouth the old hard line. The White Sword's white cloak moved behind them like a piece of winter come south. Sir Barristan's step, quiet and absolute, and Jaime Lannister's golden head turned as a cat's will turn to admire its own tail when it twitches. Varys was a soft cloud at the edge of it. Petyr Baelish was a narrow blade disguised as a reed. Their words would be used later. Now they watched. Balon stepped from the Iron Victory to the Myrish plank and did not look down to see water. He did not wear a crown. He did not need to. Aeron walked at his right hand and seemed tired and loving of the tide all at once. Victarion came behind, too heavy for grace and graceful all the same by force of exactness. Asha's smile was at the corner of her mouth, prepared, a thing she could let out or hold, and her eyes were coin bright with the pleasure of being where she was not expected to be, and standing anyway. There were other men besides, captains or masters, a black tide with a cut along his cheek that had taught him a better way to hold a shield, a Botley with a sharpness about him that made men think of hooks. They met where the deck's caulking had been replaced, and was a shade darker than the old pitch. The river's breath came slow along the planks. The sea's under-breath came up with a clean chill. Robert stopped with a man's exactness. That when he turned his head he would meet Balon's eyes, not look up or down. Balon did the same. He had counted the boards as he walked, as all captains do, even when they pretend otherwise. "Balon Greyjoy," Robert said with a voice made to fill halls. "Lord of Pike and Kraken of this rough sea. You have given me trouble, and taken my brother for a time, and taught me caution. I could bless you for the last, and damn you for the rest, and be done with it. But my men tell me it is better to put a good rope to a thing that must be kept, than to waste time bragging of how it might be crushed, with a hand too small to do it." "Men go." "Robert Baratheon," Balon answered. "You have more fat about you than the last time I saw your face, and enough sense to cover it." He did not smile. He did not put warmth into it. He put the respect that one violent man owes another, who has not lied about his violence. Jon Arryn's mouth made a fractional curve at the corners. It could have been humor or simple, while amusement at a form being filled in correctly. Stannis's jaw tightened and did not unclench. Arryn's eyes had more blue in them than gray today. There is a color in the sea when the wind blows from north by east, on a cold spring that looks like that. They spoke the words they had agreed to speak. They gave the gods' names their due without kneeling, which was new for a southern king on salt water, and a thing Robert apparently enjoyed for its novelty, if not its piety. Robert had the good sense to have let Jon Arryn write his words. Balon had the good sense to have let the sea write his. The lines on the map existed in the air between them again. And if a line drawn in air is a poor thing compared to a line drawn in law, still it has this to recommend it. The air remembers better than parchment how a man looked when he said yes. "You'll keep your dogs on a shorter leash," Robert said. But he said it before the last vow and after a breath that told the truth of that sentence. He would try, and men were not leashes, and the world had winds. "You'll keep to the bounds we've named. You'll show your teeth where the map permits and keep them out of grain houses where women carry sacks twice their weight. You'll return men alive for coin. You'll burn fewer ships and let more pass. And I'll send what I've said I'll send. If your bellies are full, maybe your hands will be too busy to light torches. Then no. I'll keep my dogs as sea dogs should be kept," Balon said. "Hungry enough to bite well. Not so starved, they gnaw their leashes. We will raid where a man might reasonably expect to guard his door at night. We will avoid burning where men have paid for their passage by oath and mark. We will not go inland like wolves. The sea is our pasture. Let the shepherds tighten their fold gates, and let us be done with this talking." "Done," Robert said. The word had the joy in it of a man who sees a table set after a long hunt. They drank, not from the same cup, because men like that drink from their own. Robert's was silver and had antlers cut along the rim like a joke he alone could tell. Balon's was horn, unadorned, worn smooth by the oil of his hand. Aeron tipped a little into the sea through the scupper, and murmured that the drowned drink last and first. Jon Arryn's eyes held a small plea toward the river, as if asking it to remember this day kindly when men forgot. Stannis stood with his face like stone and did not say, as he might have wished, that law had been carved too soft. He had been at sea. He knew what elements make law's edges finer. He held his tongue like a knife that had not found its working yet. After the words there were the other words, the ones men say with the corners of their mouths while they do not move their feet. Jaime Lannister was looking at Asha in a way that had more delight than danger in it, as if he had found a sword balanced perfectly, and wished to pick it up to learn its weight. Asha let him look, and when his eyes came to hers she inclined her head the smallest accusatory degree, and smiled as if to say that, within 10 heartbeats if she desired, it might be she who looked at him that way. Ser Barristan looked nowhere except where danger might come from. He had learned that men have many places to hide danger, and many reasons to hide it. Varys' smile was soft and sorrowful. The smile of a man who loved men for their weakness, because it gave him such interesting rooms to walk among. Baelish stood with his thumbs together, considering ropes and whether one could be built into a ladder. The scrawl of little boats around the parley grew thicker as men realized kings were near enough to see with ordinary eyes. A woman in a skiff held a baby up to make it a sign to itself that day had seen it. A boy in a coracle stared until his mother cuffed him down for showing teeth to Ironborn. The Mirish captain kept his crew's hands visible, and told them in 3 languages that if any of them sneezed at the wrong moment, he would have the sneezer's nose for his belt. It might have ended there, with good form and careful pride, and the day noted, but the sea offers its own improvisations. A squall came off the bay with a sudden little laugh. It raised the hair of the river for 100 yards, and tumbled a packet boat from the fingers, and sent a stinging rain across the deck that made men blink. It blew the king's banner flat out, and then back with a crack. And it made a sound along the Myrish rig that turned Aaron's head, as if a priest had spoken his secret name. The wind passed as quickly as it had come, but in that breath-long muddle, a small barge that had been lying low under the lee of the royal galley took its chance and shot forward with oars biting neat. Its deck bore men whose faces had not been born to the river. They had the look of cornland, of good bread and old grudges. The Mallister Eagle stood on a shield at the barge's prow, plainly, almost proudly. It was not a charge. It was a statement spoken without grammar. Lord Jason had sent men to speak what his bell had been trying to teach Seaguard for 100 years, that the sea's hand would not be allowed to reach up these days untested. They brought the barge alongside with a competence that won Victarian's respect, despite himself. There were 4 of them near enough to make sense, and 2 more with bows kept low, which is the same as keeping a dog just behind your heels with its mouth shut. They were not fools. Their captain took off his helm before he spoke, and tucked it under his arm, and did not look at the king first. He looked at Balon. "You have burned Reaver," he said. "You have burned docks and fish houses, and the boats of men who have never set foot on the deck of a ship bigger than a coracle. You have struck at us with fog and rope and coward's fire. I have come to say the bell that rings at Seaguard will not ring to your tune." He was a brave man or a stupid one. Victarion could not tell at a glance, and was not sure there was a difference that mattered. Robert's eyes brightened the way a man's will when he smells a fight he is not allowed to have. John Aaron's chin did not move. Aaron's hand had found the rail, and stroked it, as if calming a horse made shy by sudden thunder. Balon looked at the man as if he were a piece of driftwood, curious for its shape. "Your bell has always rung to the sea's tune," he said. "You have just forgotten the song and will need to be reminded of it." The Mallister captain's mouth tightened. "I speak for Lord Jason Mallister. He says this, that the terms you make with the king do not bind those of us whose lives have been spent in keeping your hands from our throats. If the king bids us lower our swords, we will hold them level. If he tells us to fold our banners, we will tie them tighter to the pole." The quiet on the deck was a new quiet. It had the quality of rope under strain, a humming you feel in your teeth. Balon did not move. Robert's jaw worked and then did not. Stannis' face went even more stone, and then a crack showed in the stone and was gone. John Aaron stepped once to his left, so that the line from Robert to Balon crossed through him, and he looked, without seeming to, at the Mallister captain. "Lord Jason is a good man," he said. "He is a proud man, and a useful one. Tell him the crown has made terms, and if he will not have them, he can ring his bell for himself. Tell him also that a king remembers which houses hold their swords by the hilt and which by the blade. Tell him to send me a letter, and not men to the king's ship. I am fond of letters." "Then," the man swallowed. He was brave enough to have come. He was not brave enough to argue with that voice. The bowmen had not raised their bows. They did not lower them either. The small wind that had made the trouble had gone to make trouble elsewhere. Men remembered how their shoulders worked when they were not tense to lift a shield. The barge backed water with precision. The Ironborn watched with a respect they would not confess, and Asha's mouth had the small smile again, the one that was as much for herself as for anyone else. Robert let out a breath that might have been a laugh, and might have been anger cleverly modulated. Balon's face became one of his, the one that men would call patience, and that was in truth accounting, an old sailor's numbers to 10. They parted on terms as planned. On their way out past the mouth, where the black waters brown braided with the green of the bay, and the tide had the final say as always, the Ironborn ships slid under the walls where kings have lived and died, and where kings' sisters have learnt to smile. In a tower whose stone was too thick to be anything but stubborn, a queen watched with a mouth like a cut in ripe fruit, and a mind like a knife left in the sea, until it took a particular temper from rust and salt. Jaime stood at her shoulder and made a jest, light as sunlight on copper. The jest did not land. Varys listened to the water as if he were a priest of some god who had never needed a temple. Baelish counted hulls with his eyes and saw coins stamped on each plank. Stannis went ashore and into the keep in a straight line, and men got out of that line because there is a look some men wear that is a law in itself. He passed a boy in a crimson doublet, who slid along the wall with the smoothness of a rat, finding its life in a kitchen where knives are kept sharp. He passed a girl who would one day be queen in everything but blessing, and who watched him go with her head tilted the way a hawk tilts its head when it has not decided if the thing before is prey or rock. He came to Jon Arryn's solar and stood until the older man raised a hand, and then they both sat, and the older man poured wine, and neither of them drank it. "You gave him what he wants," Stannis said, voice level. "I gave us time," Jon Arryn answered, "and I gave the sea its due. I find it is less expensive to pay the sea than to quarrel with it." "Then, the law is a ship on a river," Jon Arryn said softly, and looked down at his hands. "It travels. It must be kept in good repair. The channels change." Stannis' mouth became thinner. "You will die of wisdom one day," he said, and it was not a jest. "Better than dying of wine," Jon said, and it was the closest he would come to rebuke. In the Isles, the wind brought the smell of the river meeting the sea, as if smell had legs and had followed them home. Theon returned to his chores with a sense of having stood where names are made and not yet knowing if his own would ever be made, or only workmanlike. Asha took him to the ropes again and made him bleed a little in healthy ways, and when he cursed, she kissed his knuckles and laughed, and told him he cursed like a boy who had not yet learned how to hurt the world with his words. Aeron drowned a girl who had asked to be made hard, and came up hair-slicked, and eyes feral with joy, and went to her man that night, and told him he would have to learn the prayers or find a wife who feared the sky. Victarion kept his men to rhythm. The Iron Victory had her own ways of sulking and rejoicing. He knew them the way a man knows a wife who has shared his bed through winter after winter. She creaked less under him after the parley, as if the weight that ships feel even when men pretend not to were eased, by not being called upon to butt heads with kings in the literal way. He sharpened his axe and drew its edge on his thumb and was pleased when it kissed him without drawing blood. His dreams were of oars wearing grooves in the sea that could be followed like roads. Letters came like weather. Lord Jason Mallister wrote what he could not say beside a king and made his letters sharp and straight. Hoster Tully sent one soft and pretty as a river stone and hid iron in it. Tywin Lannister wrote again, this time shorter, and in the space his brevity left men could hear all the gold behind it clinking with patience. Mace Tyrell wrote a fat letter that had been perfumed and sealed 3 times and used 3 different hands to make it look as if more men agreed than had been present. Eddard Stark sent a message with Wyman Manderley's wax upon it, and the smell of fish and dill lingering on it, as if the parchment had sat under kitchen rafters. It thanked Balon for the tone he had taken, and named men who would cut timber in good places where old gods were not angered. Balon answered as a man repairs a net, with economy, 1 knot at a time, never the same knot twice if the last had held. He sent small coins with some letters, the Iron Way, to show his meaning. He sent none to the Rock. He sent a fishhook and a folded scrap of oilcloth to Lord Jason, with a line in his own hand, for your bell rope when it breaks. Euron took the silence where he pleased, because neither god nor kin had leashes sufficient for him. He went west first, and came back with a lens ground to a curiosity, and when men looked through it, they felt seasick. He went south and came back with a story about bearded priests, who slept on nails in a jar full of insects that died as soon as the lid was lifted. He went east to Fair Isle and stood on a cliff, and laughed at the way the sea made men there think humble thoughts, and then came home by way of a storm he had bought. If his eyes were to be believed, Theon watched him and found in himself both a fear and an envy that tasted like tin. There is a way the sea has of reorganizing men without their consent. It put a red wine galley and 3 cousins known as cousins only by banner in the path of 2 small iron-borne longships running night black between the Shields and the Mander. It gave a steady wind to one and a sulk to the other. The cousins bent all their pride to oars and discovered, as men do, that pride is a poor back muscle. The Ironborn did not engage. They slid like eels between the banks of light and were gone when men had found their shouting voices. That small restraint was a victory greater than 3 burned hulls would have been. It taught the Reach a fresh lesson, that a kraken can swim past your bedroom window and not scratch the glass. And the not scratching was a threat you could not answer. It did not prevent other lessons. Shield Island farmers waking before dawn to find their traps cut and their pigs slaughtered to the bone in neat work will still tell their children Ironborn came into the house and trod quietly among their dreams and left with their footfalls folded into the day. A small cove on the coast of the Shiar Ag lost 5 boys to the sea on a single afternoon that was both bright and treacherous. Men spoke of currents and women spoke of omens, and an old man said nothing and turned his net right side out and pretended it had been wrong side before. The sea kept count and did not share its account book. On Seaguard's high tower, Lord Jason rang his bell half a mark past noon. One day for no reason his men could see, and when they looked up, they saw a longship as neat as a thought and as dark as a joke sliding across the horizon at a distance that could not threaten them. It did not change its course. It did not show its sail. It took the wind that was given and made from it exactly the speed it needed to keep men's pride alive and sharpen their caution to the cutting point. Theon learned that a rope can lie even when it looks true. There are strands that seem equal and are not, strands that will let you down when wet, strands that will take a knot and never release it. He learned it with his palms, and then with his shoulders, and then one cold afternoon on black tide, when the wind came down in a sled of knives, he learned it with the whole of him, the water teaching his bones grammar with a thoroughness no septon could match. Asha pulled him up by the scruff and laughed at him and kissed his eyebrow where the rope had burned him and said he had earned his first scar proper. Aaron poured seawater on his head afterward and made the prayer, and Theon's teeth chattered against the rim of holiness. That night he dreamed of a bell that had learned to drown and woke wanting to laugh and not knowing why it made him want to cry. Word came north from the court that the king was hunting boar in the Kingswood and had nearly taken a tusk to the thigh out of respect for his own narrative, and that the queen had smiled at dinner and dropped a cup in a way that made 3 men reach to catch it at once and learn to hate one another softly. A rumor came with the word that John Aaron had had a cough for 2 days and had sent for elm bark and unguents. Another rumor canceled the first. Rumors are tides of their own. They fetch up scum on the shore and leave behind useful shells if you are willing to get your fingers dirty. The Ironborn did not care about coughs in halls. They listened for the noises ships make when paint dries and ropes are new, and the hand that has put them together has not mended a net in winter in a house with a roof that leaks. In Lannisport, Tarl the carpenter, who had been building ships since he was a boy and had a thumb that looked like an old cork, stood before a row of half-ribs in a new yard and spat blackly and calculated the years left to him and found them enough for 1 great moment and 3 good ones. He could smell gold in the pitch. He could feel the rock at his back, like a debt you owed, but had time to pay. Tywin Lannister walked through the yard once and did not touch anything and touched everything. He asked one question about wind that made Tarl nod despite himself. He did not smile. He left a bag of coins and 2 men who both thought themselves apprentices and would die of a splinter in the thumb and a fall from a ladder respectively, and a clerk who would never die, because young clerks do not die. They grow into old clerks like hills do. In Highgarden, Mace Tyrell planned a naval triumph in his mind and learned the names of knots from a book and put the book aside with a shudder because the knots did not wear lace. Paxter Redwine uncorked a cask of a particular white and tasted his embarrassment and set the cup down neatly and sent for his fastest captains and counted in his head how many barrels of pitch the arbor had and how many he could borrow, and whether the Spice King of Korth would be offended if he asked for a favor no one would be able to name without laughter. At Winterfell, Eddard Stark listened to Wyman Manderly talk of harbor chains that could be raised in a blink and of old hulls found sunk in river mud that still had ribs sound as old oaths. And when the talk was done, Eddard went to the Godswood and stood among the red leaves and looked at the heart tree until he could not tell what part of him was man and what part was a root. He sent a letter to Balon Greyjoy, whose words were an old man's courtesy written by a man who was not yet old, and when the raven left his wrist he watched it go until it was the same color as his doubts. Summer moved along the water like a woman who knows she is watched and disdains to notice it. The sea went green to blue and then blue to that particular silver only certain afternoons can provide. Fish came into the nets, and men mended holes, and told the old stories to boys who stopped watching the girls for a minute to listen. Asha took 2 long ships to the coast near salt pans, and taught the men there to throw their ropes faster. They yelled and fell, and sometimes laughed as they fell. Victarion led a quiet dance around the Mandar's mouth, never closer than a good archer's shot. Always close enough to teach the archer's humility about the wind. Euron came back from a place he did not name with sand in his lashes, and a faint smell of cinnamon that made men's stomachs wonder what bread could smell like that. And then, because the sea likes to make jokes slow, the bell at Seaguard rang, and did not stop for an hour. And when it stopped, the sound of it kept ringing in men's teeth for another. It rang because a fisherman's boy had taken his coracle out beyond the lines men told him, and he had seen sails as black as an idea and hulls as low as a lie. And he had come back with his face white with salt and fear, and cried words that made other men's faces harden the way they do when a tooth meets ice. The long ships off the crag had not been a preface. They had been a rehearsal. Now the sea wrote its sentence out in long neat lines, commas and semicolons, and the occasional exclamation where a reef demanded it. It was not Balon's doing. He was at Pike that day, watching a piece of tar drip along a seam, and thinking of shapes no mapmaker had yet invented for declaring restraint. It was not Victarion's, who was south near Fair Isle with his eyes on a particular shoal that could be taught to bite only when asked. It was not Asha's, who had taken a different lesson north to men on Harlaw, who were beginning to mistake their pride for wisdom. It was Euron's. The silence led a dozen, and a dozen was enough if each were in the right hands, and the weather had decided to cheat for your pleasure. They slid along Seaguard's sightline and did not touch, a lover's threat. Then, because a joke is no joke if it never finds its punch, they darted in where the river made a foolish promise to the sea about being safe behind walls, and took 5 small boats in a blink, and cut only 3 throats because the point had been made with the taking. The bell rang because bells ring when the sea touches land without asking. Jason Mallister stood on the tower and watched and kept his men, and the keeping was a kind of victory that did not taste like one. When word came back to Pike, Balon stood in the hall and listened to the telling, and did not speak for a time. Men waited and made the old Ironborn sign, that is neither pious nor casual, but something between. Aaron's hand tightened on the strand of driftwood in his hair. His eyes were a weather change. "This is not one of my knives," Balon said at last. "This is my brother's." He looked at the door, and in 2 breaths Euron was there. Not because he had been called, but because he had been waiting to be called. "You will not make terms into toys," Balon told him. "You will not prick men so they bleed on a day of my choosing, and then call it the sea's hand." Euron's smile widened and flattened, the way a fish widens under a knife. "The sea does not take terms," he said. "It takes men," I reminded them. "I took not more than I could carry in one hand. I let them keep their bell. You will keep to my rope," Balon said, "or I will make a rope of you." The hall held that sentence like a jar holds a bright thing. Euron's head tilted the smallest bit, as if he had not heard correctly. But he had heard. He glanced at Asha and back to Balon. And then, because this was not the day he had decided to test the depth of the old man's arm, he bowed, a small mockery turned respectable by precision. "As my lord commands," he said. After that, Euron did as instructed for a fortnight, and then did something else entirely. He turned his prow east past Old Wick, and then due west along a course no map suggests, and then south again, and came to a lonely headland on Fair Isle's western lee, where the sea makes a peculiar hiss on certain tides. And he cut his own palm and let the blood fall into the hiss, and laughed when a seal lifted its head and barked as if it had understood a joke. He returned with nothing in his hold, and his eyes narrowed as if squinting into a light other men could not see. Theon saw none of that. He was in a low room with a warm smell, learning how to take a hook from a fish's mouth without hurting the fish or the man, and thinking of Seaguard's bell, and wondering how a sound could be brave. Asha watched him and told him a story about a boy who had tried to climb the sea stone chair when the hall was empty, and had sat and felt no power, and had come down ashamed, and then had learned that power is not in chairs. He asked if the boy had been her or him. She said it had been both. Autumn made one of its quick feints at winter and sent cold rain across the aisles in long, clean sheets that washed gull droppings from stones and men's faces and made the ropes swell with an old joy. Grain from the crown came, smaller casks than had been named, and not quite as sweet, but enough to keep the greedy children from getting the last ladle and learning ugly lessons about being last. A letter came with the grain in John Aaron's hand, apologizing for the difference, with a neat honesty that made Alanis fold the parchment and put it away instead of burning it for spite. Balon sent fish back in casks to fall and had them delivered to Seaguard and not to King's Landing. A small impudence that proved a larger wisdom. Kings come and go, but men who keep bells live long in the mind. There is a way the sea has of making even peace a labor. Men who had raided for the first sensation of blood in the nose learned to take satisfaction in the neatness of a rope, the cleanness of a splice, the way a sail can be mended so the wind does not notice where it was torn. Victorian praised those things more in a day than he had praised killing in a year. His men grew quiet and proud with a new pride, the pride of saying tomorrow to a ship instead of no go away. Aaron's sermons took on more patience as well as more stone. He spoke often of the hall below the waves where hunger is gone, and of the way the sea tests, not because it wishes to find men weak, but because it loves them when they are stronger. Men found they liked themselves better in that telling. Asha's laughter became the sound a deck makes at the moment a man learns his balance. Theon's hands got heavier with work and more clever with knives. It could not last forever, because nothing does, not even the seas pretending to stand still. A raven came down out of a sky that had been the right color at dawn and the wrong color an hour later, and it brought a letter from King's Landing that smelled of tallow and too many hands. John Aaron's cough had come back and stayed and made a home. There is a rust that eats quietly at good iron till a man puts his hand on the beam, and his palm comes away stained. Robert had written his name upon the letter as if by doing so he could sign the sickness away. The flourish was angry, as if anger were a treatment. Balon read and said nothing, because what was there to say to a cough? Men die dorten. Hands change on the ropes. But a cough in the hand's chest meant other hands at a quill and other ideas about what lines on a map mean. Alanis watched him not react and knew him reacting. Asha felt the change the way a pilot feels the tide turn before it has got hold of the oars yet. Aaron went to the strand and spoke longer to the crabs than usual. Euron looked to the east and to the west, and then down, and smiled. Before the winter gales began in earnest, a last parley was held, smaller and less ceremonious than the first. It was on a low sea between Orkmont and Old Wick, to exchange a parcel of men for coin, and to agree a small adjustment in the line south of the crag, where a reef had proved more ambitious than the map had credited. Lord Jason Mallister did not come. A lesser eagle did, and kept his eyes level. A Tully man came with a neat face and a memory for insult that could double as a ledger. From King's Landing came not John Aaron, but a clever fellow in a cloak, the color of dried blood and a smile that would have made Pettier Baelish clap like a child. He talked of efficiencies and of how grain might be measured, in a way that would save both sides coin and face. Victorian, who had never been much for numbers, liked him despite himself, and disliked him despite that. Asha took his measure and found him entertaining, which is a kind of danger that wears its own sweet mask. There was a box on that parley, with slits for air and old stains along the grain. It contained a man with a red nose and a talent for making the drunk laugh and the sober weep, and the Mallister man wanted him for his lord's hall because winter comes hard to Seaguard, and words are a craft that can warm hands. The Ironborn had meant to keep the man for a heavy ransom, because the Riverlands open their purses for tears as readily as the Reach opens its bottles for wine. Balon took the coin and let the box be carried away, and watched the way the man inside held his breath. Theon watched too, and told himself he was learning something about value. When the first ice came on the rock pools, and the crabs moved more slowly and resignedly, and the sea took on its iron smell, after the soft algae stinks of summer, Balon went to the seaward bridge, and stood while the wind made his cloak behave. The night was a clean one, and not unfriendly. The stars had seen him speak with kings and with boys and with himself, and seemed uninclined to change their gossip on his account. He thought of the bell at Seaguard, and of the girls who had held casks for grain in King's Landing, and of the way Eddard Stark's letter had been folded, as if it had been folded by a man who preferred to fold maps. He put his palm on the rope, and the rope spoke in its way. A little shiver, the memory of 50 storms, the oil from his skin accepted and made into a history. "What is dead may never die," he said without volume, and the wind did not answer him, not because it disapproved, but because it had nothing to add. He made a count in his head of 50 things that could break the rope, and then he made a count of 50 things that would hold it. He thought of the boy sleeping 3 rooms away, and of the girl 3 chambers beyond that with a knife under her pillow, and of the brothers who stood one on each side of the world, and pulled in opposite directions with equal will. And he found himself smiling, not happily, but with the grin a man gives a storm he has decided to meet on the beach and not in bed. Winter found ways to slip between doors. The grain casks shrank. Men made longer stories by the hearth, and women listened with their heads turned sideways to hear the lie in them. The wind that hates men came one night along the western shore and knocked down 2 sheds and a boy and passed on with a pleased hiss. The Iron Victory slept in her cove with a cat's patience, ready to jump at dawn if asked. Asha invented a game with knives and went into a barn to teach it, and came out with a cut on her arm that pleased her too much. Aeron made an offering of 3 bones and a gull's foot, and felt the sea smile. Euron bored holes in a piece of driftwood with a heated pin, and watched the smoke, and thought of fire that does not mind water. In the south, Jon Arryn's cough decided it would stay for good company and held back a feast. He whispered to his king in a tone the king could still hear over the press of hunt and drink and anger. The king grumbled and obeyed where it cost him least to do so. Cersei bore her patience as a woman bears an old jewel. She does not love because other people love it when she wears it. Jaime practiced with a man who did not know his name, and killed the man by accident, and told himself the man had been tired. Stannis wrote letters that tied knots around other letters, and did not cut them because he did not trust other men with knives. Varys added a page to his book in invisible ink. Baelish bought a ship and sold it the same day, and made coin for both men, and tied the coin to an obligation that would not come due for years. Tywin Lannister sent his regards to the shipwright with the crooked thumb, and did not disguise his impatience with the pace timber chooses. The rock remembers only what it has ordered. Theon grew an inch, and found that inch had gone to his wrists. He went into the sea when Aeron said to go, and endured the way it took all his breath at once, and left him laughing when it had given it back. He learned to stand where the ball used to make his stomach complain. He learned to look at Euron without letting the other man's smile get into his thoughts. He learned that Victarion had a particular quiet when he watched Asha throw a knife that meant he would rebuke the world if it ever tried to take that from him. He learned how to say no to his father by saying yes to the sea. One night, when the wind had calmed, and the rain had settled into a small steady diligence, and the ropes dripped with a softened pride, Theon woke with a start. He had dreamed again of drowning, and of the place after drowning where there is no bending work and no hunger, and his fingers were clever, and did not fumble. And in the dream Asha had been there, and had a crown of sea grass, and Aeron had laughed, and it had not been terrifying. He woke, and the room was only a room again, and he lay with his hand on the pallet's coarse blanket, and listened to the sea breathe. He thought of King's Landing, and the oxblood cloak and letters that smell of hands. He thought of the bell at Seaguard, and the way Euron's laugh sometimes slid out of a room ahead of him like a wet thing. He thought of his father's hand on the bridge rope, and the 50 breakings, and the 50 holdings. He whispered the prayer as if to himself but to the sea as well. It put its cold hand on his hair and smoothed it back, and did not promise him anything. That was its way. He slept again, and in that sleep he did not drown. He swam, long and slow, under stone bridges, and along the ribs of ships, and out to where the stars come down and put their faces in the water, and let the cold kiss them like an old lover. He woke hungry as a boy should wake, and went to find a knife to cut bread with, and to see if Asha would let him take the tiller at last for a full watch, if the wind held. In the morning, the wind held. The sea made a new promise, the kind that is only a way of saying, It will do what it must, and men will call it promise or betrayal, according to their supper. The Ironborn went out and came in. The king to the south drank and roared, and was silent in correct moments, because he had a sense of theater. The hand to the south coughed and wrote and coughed, and slept with a neat blanket on his knees, because he disliked being messy even in pain. The rock to the west added another rib to a ship whose name had already been chosen, and would be the name of a storm one day. The reach to the south watched its vines and made plans, and baked bread with raisins in it, and hoped the sea would like the smell enough to be reasonable. The north to the north placed its hands on trees, and on axes, and counted, as the north always counts, without bothering to boast about the numbers, when the numbers will be proved by weather later. Balon stood on his bridge and counted as well. Ships, sons, daughters, storms past, storms to come, the breaths between oar strokes, the men who could be trusted with a parley, and the men who could be trusted with a fire, the miles his enemies could sail, and the miles a rumor could travel in a court where rumor had learned how to ride a straight-backed horse. He found his numbers true enough to keep, and where they were not true, he put them aside like worn netting, and went to get rope. What is dead may never die. The sea is a grave, and it is a womb, and it is a workroom where men learn what their hands are for. The kraken keeps its patience. The bell in Seaguard rings when it must. The rock does not forget. The hand that coughs writes a neat last line. The long ships make their long shadows at sunset. The boy grows and the girl laughs, and the brother with the crow's eye looks east and west and down. And winter comes as it always does, on its long iron feet, with the wind full of names that have been said often enough to be worn smooth with use. And the sea welcomes it with its own old indifference and carries on. The first snow came slyly, as if it had been told to keep itself small, so as not to alarm the islands. It dusted the black shoulders of rock along the strand, and salted the long curves of the boat sheds. Gulls left clear hieroglyphs where they trod, and the tracks of men and boys overlaid those marks with their own insistence. The air had that sharp metallic smell that belongs to winter dawns, and the sea wore it with the same indifference it wears the scent of blood, tar, wine, and dying prayers. Balon Greyjoy woke to the sense of a different weight on the world, and lay for a moment in that sober hour between sleep and duty, while the wind told him what it had done in the night. He rose, buttoned himself into old leather that remembered storms better than men remembered their fathers, and went out to where the bridges sang softly to themselves. The sky had a bruise in it to the west. Somewhere beyond that bruise, a red wine captain was counting oars, and telling himself that numbers make weather obey. Balon smiled with his teeth shut, and let the rope of the bridge answer his palm. The rope was never the same from day to day. He liked that. It kept men honest. He broke his fast with porridge and salt fish, and a cup of beer that had been brewed in a season when the hops had decided they would be bitter. Alani sat opposite and looked at him without sentiment, which was its own tenderness in a marriage like theirs. Asha came in with flakes of snow tangled in her hair, and shook her head like a seal, painting the rushes white around her feet. Theon followed her with his mouth red from the cold, and his eyes bright with the discovery that the same places he had known all his life were different under a cover of frost. Victarion arrived later, chewing as if food were a knot to be worked and swallowed when the rope consented. Aeron came last and sat without touching his bowl until he had gone into himself and returned, his lips making the old words in silence. "The reader wants me on Harlaw," Asha said when her mother had pushed the bowl nearer, and she had eaten half of it and decided she was done. "He has maps that he thinks are truer than the men who made them." Balon nodded. "Go," he said. "Bring back the truer parts." Asha's mouth made that curve that was neither coy nor cruel, but some mixture of salt and delight. "I will bring back the parts you will give room for, father," she said, and went to buckle on her knives. The 10 Towers were a library made into an island, or an island that had learned to read. The buildings themselves climbed each other with the patient logic of masonry that knows storms better than architects do. On storm days, the towers spoke to one another in the voice of iron ladders and cunning doors. On quiet days, they listened to the pages men turned, and the soft coughs of candles guttering. Asha loved the place the way a hunter loves a fine stable. She was not made to live here, but she admired the breed. Roderick Harlaw, called the Reader, met her in a chamber whose windows were as narrow as a miser's charity, and whose shelves tilted under the weight of knowledge acquired in ways that would have made other iron-born uncomfortable. He wore a sober cloak and had the kind of hands that take their time. His hair lay like dry rope along his brow. He kissed his niece on both cheeks and then, as always, moved to the table with its parchment and its patience. "They send us letters that pretend maps are law," he said, not with anger. "Maps are records of old decisions made by dead men about rivers that have since changed their minds. Since they rely on their maps, we must rely on the parts maps cannot hold." Then he showed her coastal diagrams done by a man with a monk's hand and a raider's eye. Sketches of gullies that look like nothing at low tide and become knives at half tide. Reed beds that hide mud firm enough for a light hull and none else. The wash of sand where a boat can be beached and pushed off again without grating the keel. He showed her the little arrows he drew for current, and the small teeth marks he made at places where Rex had taught him caution. "The Mander's mouth will keep changing," he said. "The shields may learn caution. They will not learn humility, because humility is not a Reach virtue. The Redwines take pride in the relenting character of waves. They think the sea can be negotiated. Remind them it can only be read." Nenderwal. Asha smiled and tapped a spot he had marked with a neat X here. She said, "There's a bar they will not credit in a fog. We will not be there to teach them. We will be here." Her fingers slid to a cove that wore a little hook like a laughing mouth. "And their pride will run aground itself while we count and keep a civil tongue." The Reader's eyes had the quiet brightness of a man who lives most of his life in head weather and only sometimes comes out to smell the salt. "Your father will not always be able to hold the rope for you," he said. "Your uncles will have opinions, and opinions are storms. Learn the bottom. It is bottom that keeps a ship honest." "I am learning," Asha said. "I learn every time I make a landing, and do not disgrace the dock." He poured her ale, and did not apologize for the thin head. He did not apologize for anything. They spoke of other things. The bell at Seaguard, which had stopped ringing like a challenge and started to ring like a habit. The letter from Winterfell and the feeling inside it of a man who loves wood more than policy. The cough in the south that came and went like a tide that did not obey the moon. When at last she rose and belted her cloak tighter and headed for the stair, he put his palm flat on the vellum as if blessing it. "Tell your father this," he said at the door, and his voice was softer than his words. "It is not enough to outfight men who cannot fight you. It is better to outlast them." Theon did not go to Harlaw. He went down to Lordsport with Victarion and learned to stand on the Iron Victory's deck, when the first thin ice lay like spun glass on the calm between hulls. He learned to put his weight where the ship wanted it, not where his pride wanted it. He learned to coil rope so that it would speak cleanly when called upon, and to stow it so that it would not learn bad habits. He learned the sound an oar pin makes just before it fails, and the word to shout that is not a word for mothers. Victarion was sparing with praise and sparing with punishment. The same spareness in both made men measure themselves by him rather than seeking to avoid his hand or win it. At night, Theon slept with the smell of pitch in his hair and the particular ache in his thighs that belongs to boys who have climbed aboard and aloft 100 times in a day. Once in a week, Aeron took him and others down to the strand and drowned them in the water that had taken his own breath and given it back harder and stronger. Aeron's voice in prayer was a low metal. His eyes went so far in that when he came back to the surface of the world he always seemed to need a moment to recognize it. Theon loved him a little and feared him a little, and did not know how to sort those feelings cleanly. He accepted that as a sign of wisdom. A man who sorts his feelings too cleanly becomes a Greenlander, he told himself, and had to hide his smile because it pleased him to think the thought, and because it pleased him to be rebuked by it. In King's Landing, the cough in the hand's chest took up quarters. It set out a chair for itself, and sat with the patience of a tenant who has found a landlord too gentle to evict him. John Arryn wrote through it until his hand shook, and then he dictated until his voice would not play accompaniments for sense any longer. Robert Baratheon hunted between the coughs, as if he could find a pig that would gore illness itself, and bring it down in a welter of well-told blood. Cersei wore her hair like a banner, and kept her mouth in order. If anyone thought to remark on the temper of her eyes, they were wise enough to do it in a whisper. Varys made noise like silk, and read the sea's new grammar with the modesty of a fat man who never blushes. Baelish took 2 columns and made them 1. Where he had none, he invented one. Stannis Baratheon went to Dragonstone and read his own lessons. He stood on a gargoyle with melted shadows in its wings and watched the sea wear its winter face. He thought of a massed splinter pushing along the skin above his temple, and the sound of an axe biting into wood that had been mistaken for flesh, and the feel of ropes on a deck not his. He had not wept for that defeat. He had not had the organ required for it. He had added it to the ledger he kept with himself and with the world. He spoke to his shipwrights in a voice that could have carved your name into a hull, without need of a knife, and planned ore rooms and rib sets and stern posts long after his men had stifled their yawns. It is a terrible thing, a man's fairness to himself when it finds its work upon others. Paxter Redwine watched the weather in the glass of his wingcups and found it to be too sweet. He set the cup aside and walked his yards with a face he kept for the sea and his creditors, and the part of his soul that counted injuries by their interest. He sent scouts with light hands and heavier purses. He had found that a purse gets answers a sword cannot, and he preferred answers in winter when swords begin to grow dull in men's fingers. He talked with Mace Tyrell and made a little noise with his throat that a man might mishear as courtesy, and was in truth contempt for lace. He dreamed of a day when the arbor's sails gnawed black out of a sky Ironborn had taught to be humble. Tywin Lannister went down to his new yards, with his men in their crimson and his words. Stripped of paint. He had a fur rug brought for the soles of his boots, and then stood on the frozen ground by preference, so that men would remember he had stood there. Tarl the carpenter showed him a keel laid like a quiet promise, and a set of frames rising like the ribs of a lion under flayed skin. Tywin did not nod until exactly the right moment. He withheld and then gave with mathematical effect. He paid on time. He made it known that those who cheated him would find their sons in need of swords that could not be made. Men work differently under certain kinds of gold. They do not know why, and perhaps no one does. Lord Jason Mallister took his bell rope in hand each morning and gave 1 clean pull and listened to the tower answer him. The bell had learned caution. It did not ring like a goose now. It rang like a memory. He trained his garrison in sleet and taught them to stand a watch so still that you see your enemy in the corner of your eye before he sees himself. He wrote letters to River Run and received answers that smelled faintly of mildew and affection and pain behind the words that could not be named. Hoster Tully's hand was not steady, and the ink told it. Lysa's hand was precise and unkind. Edmure's had the optimism of a man who has not yet learned how an oar wears your shoulder when it is not the oar you expected to carry. White Harbor sent a boat into the Bight under colors so civil they could have been bishop's robes. It met an Ironborn trader off the Sisterton Rocks, a place where smugglers had taught Tide to climb like a dog onto a table and steal with its tail. The White Harbor boat bore a quiet man who had the kind of belly that keeps men warm in winter and the eyes of a good cook. He called himself Wren. Perhaps he had once flown without effort. Perhaps he had married into a song. He spoke for Lord Wyman and did not offer wine until he had offered news and had taken news in return. Our Lord offers grain again at a price that will not dishonor us or tempt his confidences, Wren said, sitting on a coil of rope and smelling the winter with professional skepticism. He offers salt too, and fish hooks. We make good hooks in White Harbor. Your men deserve good hooks. My men respect an honest hook, the Ironborn captain said, which was near enough to courtesy for that sea. And we would have you pass word on the matter of courtesy, Wren added with a little sigh, as if humility bored him but he had long practice at it. If you're mutes, he did not say Euron's name. Some names are storms, and better not to be called. If your mutes will swear not to come into our outer roads, we will give you leave to come as far as Maiden's Gate, and show your sails to frighten children in a way that pleases them, and then be off. It keeps the king's coin sweet to his palate if we can say we look upon you without stabbing. We will trade in the dark places as men always have. We will pretend to be ashamed, and then we will eat our suppers. Man. The captain rubbed his beard and looked up at a gull that was thinking of him. I will tell my lord, he said. If he thanks you, do not be proud. I am a cook, Wren said. I let men think their pride has fed them. I eat what is left in the pot. He smiled then, and the smile had warmth in it, and the sea forgave him for a moment his softness. Asha rode those back lanes and front corridors of winter politicking with a dancer's delight. She did not trust men who wore rings set with gems and smelled of things her nose could not pronounce. She trusted lists. She trusted the list she saw in her father's head when he watched Euron enter a room and leave it as if the walls had moved to let him pass. She trusted the list she saw in Roderick's hands when he sorted currents and men. She trusted the one Victarion made when he sharpened his axe and counted the breaths it took to take a blade from dull to keen. She trusted her own list, in which she kept 24 small coves, 6 shoals, the names of 3 women who would never lie to her until the day they did, and the 2 places on Asha's own body where fear sometimes put its hand, and she had learned to move so it fell away. She could not see inside Euron's lists. They were written with ink that tastes of salt and certain burned herbs, and they were stacked in a cupboard that opens only toward the dark. He went away for 3 days in snow, and came back with his hair bright from ice and his cheek livid with cold, and he laughed softly when Aeron came to speak to him about the drowned god's will. And he put his hand on Aeron's shoulder, as if he were a boy, and Aeron flinched as if that hand had been made of something less than man. When Euron stood alone at the tower and looked west, it was not west he was looking toward. Some men learned to look down. Balon held his lords in the great hall, so that the firelight made their rough faces beautiful in the way of old stone. Good brothers with salt in their beards and the stamp of great wykes, granite in the set of their jaws. Botleys with fish in their eyes and lordsports wind in their posture. Black tides a little narrowed by the hard winter, their little island always finds first. Drums with their brazen confidence and Dunstan wearing red rain, the Valyrian sword that answered questions before he formed them. Harlaws in several cuts, some of them clever and some of them merely strong. Orkwoods quiet as a slope of peat. The lines are a courtesy, Balon told them, making his voice the even weight that binds a net and makes it fit to be hung. But the sea does not read maps. If you keep to courtesy when it profits us, you will have my hand in your quarrels. If you use the king's words as a cloak for cowardice, I will make you an example that will feed men's talk in winter. Then shall. Dunstan Drum smiled with the unpleasant charm of a man who has not yet been rebuked often enough by the world to mend his ways. I like an example if I am allowed to make it, he said. You will practice your liking on the mainland's calves when the calf's mother is not in the field, Balon said. You will not pull a cow by the tail and then write me that she kicked. There was laughter. It was the harsh, relieved laughter that comes when a lord has not worshipped his own words and has made men safe to speak. Asha caught her father's eye and saw there not love, though he loved her as a man like him loves, which is with deed, not speech, but a delegation of work. She nodded a fraction and understood herself assigned. That night, after men had drunk enough to warm themselves, and not enough to forget where to put their feet on the bridges, Aeron stood up and sang the drowning song in a voice that found its own echo in the hall's long bones. He named the drowned by their names, as he always did. He lifted a bowl and poured a libation on the stones. The fire hissed and then took the offering into itself like an old woman taking sweetened milk. He spoke of Naga's ribs on Old Wyke and the hall the Grey King had made there. He spoke of the time before kings when the sea had been the only throne on which men sat. He did not speak of crowns. He spoke of salt. Men slept well after such speeches, because the soul likes to be told it is perched on something permanent, even when it knows better. Letters came with the last of the year's clean weather. One bore John Aaron's hand again, thin as fishing line, speaking of courtesy, continuity, and the way the law must not crack visibly in winters, lest men try it with their fingernails, the way boys try ice on a pond. One bore Eddard Stark's. a precise acknowledgement that timbering had begun in certain backwaters, and that axes had been blessed or not blessed, according to the tree's preference. It spoke in a line that Balon read 3 times, of wolves that remember and do not speak. Tywin's men wrote for him. Neat, clipped, fatal. Mace Tyrell wrote again, and once more his letter had been dressed in other men's competence. Paxter Redwine wrote briefly and without perfume, and his words smelt of a man who had walked his yards until he had learned their language and had fallen out of love with toys. The Crown's letter simply bore Robert's name scratched hard and a postscript from Stannis in a hand like graven bark that said, "Do not mistake my silence for forgetfulness." Asha took Theon with her to Old Wick when the wind had made its choice to stay in from the west for 3 whole days, and the sea had its heavy satisfied look. The ribs of Naga arched out of the stone as if something so large had once risen from the deep that the island was only what was left of its sleep. The place smelled older than water. It had a taste in the mouth like teeth set hard just before a man says a name he does not want to say. The drowned men were there in their seaweed and their ropes, their faces weathered into the theology that the sea makes necessary. Aeron stood among them, with the quiet joy of a husbandman looking upon his herd. Theon's second drowning came there. Aeron's hands were mnemonic stone. The water's cold tore the breath from Theon's chest and put it back hungrier than before. A voice he did not know he had went out of him without his permission, a sound older than his manhood. When he rose and gasped the old words, the sky seemed briefly closer and then politely retreated. Asha stood on the stone, hair rat-tailed with spray, and watched him without condescension. She had died in this way. She had come back. If pride is ever reverent, it was then. She put her hand on his hair as he sat shivering, and that touch conveyed more history than any speech in any hall. "Again?" Theon said when he could shape words. Aeron smiled, and the smile had no teeth in it. "Always," he said. "Until the last time, which is the first time also." They went after to a low cave where the fire behaved itself, and Asha told him stories with very little decoration, stories about good brothers who had cut men off from their retreat and then thrown down bread after them so they would not starve before they drowned, about a Botley woman who had held a quay under arrow fire so her husband's boat could come up on a bowline, about the time Roderick the Reader had told 3 captains they were fooling. Theon listened until he slept, and when he slept, he dreamt of the sea in a way that did not hurt. Spring made little experiments with the world. It greened certain strands of grass along the cliff faces and made river mouths push their brown farther into the sea's green with childlike insistence. The sea indulged this for a while, and then, as it always does, absorbed the river and made it part of its work. The Iron Victory slid under gulls that had not yet learned to steal properly. Asha took the smaller longships into places men expected to be safe and taught them to say please of their own accord. Victarion kept his men at the oars and their minds on their hands. Aeron went among the houses and made the young into believers and made the old into priests by letting them talk themselves into it. News moved stubbornly over the land while it flew quick over the water. Hoster Tully's illness kept him near the window where he could smell the river and be reminded of the bargain he had made with his pride in his youth. Riverrun's towers stayed lit a little later. Lord Edmure tried on 3 different faces and found that none of them yet fitted. Lord Jason Mallister's bell learned a new note that no one else heard. In the south, John Arryn's cough did not leave. He married Patience to Iron and found the marriage tolerable. Robert hunted and loved and shouted and was quiet and loved again and drank and remembered battle with a grin that had more longing than wisdom in it. Cersei smiled and cut apples at table with a knife, as efficient as a whispered rumor. She laid the slices in her mouth one by one as if they were courtesies she could accept without owing more. Tywin launched a ship and named it with a lion name that carried a pun only he enjoyed. It slid into Lannisport's water as a sleek animal may slide into brush. Men cheered out of habit and hunger. Paxter Redwine sent out 5 galleys to count the Krakens, and 3 returned with very precise numbers, and 2 did not return. Stannis sent to the stepstones for men who had learned tides the hard way, and paid them in coin and disdain, and found that they did not mind disdain if the coin was weighty and the plan precise. In Pike, Balon watched the readers and the doers, the debtors and the paid. He made a plan of his own that had nothing to do with maps. Plans are a kind of weather. He sent Asha to White Harbor, not as raider and not as guest, but as complication. He sent Theon to 10 Towers with a sack of hooks and a mouthful of questions and orders to come back with at least half the questions still unspent. He sent Victorian south to remind a set of fishermen along Casey's Lee that iron-born courtesy can be as profitable as fear. He allowed Euron to go nowhere in particular, because you cannot forbid a storm. You can only build your house correctly and keep your door on its leather hinges. Asha went north into the Bight under sail that had learned to accept the wind rather than fight it. She had Theon at her side because she had taken from her father the understanding that boys grow stronger when they are permitted to look upon the world while it is busy. The sisters lay low on the water like otters with their bellies warmed. House Sunderland does not forget the price of suzerains and the profit of smuggling. Asha met the Sunderlands in a little hall that smelled of fish, and turned old wine and watched their narrow, clever faces measure hers. "We are loyal," the eldest Sunderland said. Which meant, to the Vale when spies are listening, to ourselves when they are not, to the sea when no one is watching. "We will ask you nothing to break your oaths," Asha said truthfully, "because it is better to ask men to break their habits. Oaths change when habits do. We will ask you to remember that boats with black sails do not always mean a winter without fish. Sometimes they mean a summer without wolves." The sistermen did not smile, because they seldom do. They have learned that smiles are indulgences best kept private. They gave her a narrow room with warmth and a fish stew with too much pepper, because they cannot help themselves, and a map that had been made 30 years ago by a man with very good eyes and a very poor sense of when to stop writing notes in the margins. Asha lay awake and listened to the tide speak to the pilings in a language her body understood, and was not bored. White Harbor was all honest stone and new coin, and the confidence of people whose children do not cry from hunger in winter, except in stories used to remind them to eat the crusts. The merman's court wore its coral and pearl like a lord wears a cloak he loves because it makes other men respect his tailor. Lord Wyman received Asha in a chair that had been made to laugh at men too slender to bear much weight. He smiled like a man who wishes you to notice that he can still take a table with both hands and shake sense onto it. He introduced Manderley daughters with amused pride, and did not apologize for their plumpness. He knew that in the north, fat is merely a different word for wise. "The king's grain will come by the river," he said, "but we are not only the king's men. We are the north too, and the north means to keep its long memories tidy. I will trade hooks for flour and oil for salt. I will not be seen to trade with you, and I will see to it that it is known in the proper houses that your longships have learned new manners. If one of your mutes," the distaste on his mouth was not feigned, "should by misadventure be found in my outer harbor, I would be grieved in a way that would make me send men to the king to cry insult." Asha ate the baked eel they set before her, and drank beer thick enough to be a story on its own. She watched Wyman's eyes. They were not lazy. "We will keep our men honest," she said, "when it profits us. We will profit from honesty this winter. In summers we will test the lines the king has drawn and show him that they are drawn in water." "That is law," Wyman said softly. "I am fond of law. I prefer it written on stone. But I have learned that all laws are in truth written on water. The trick is to pretend otherwise while keeping your boat afloat." Then he sent her away with casks that had not been counted twice, and a sense that he would one day be an enemy if she were foolish, and a friend if she were wise. Theon stood in the merman's court and tilted his head back to look at the painted ceiling, and a girl with cheeks like new bread laughed at him for being a boy, and then blushed when he looked back at her and did not smile as a boy smiles. Wyman saw that and put it in his pocket to use later if later came. On their return, a storm met them between Sisters and Orkmont. A tight, resentful storm that had not been given enough respect by the sky, and had decided to take it from the sea. The longship learned again how to climb water that does not wish to be climbed. Theon made a mistake and put his weight wrong at a moment when the boat needed to lean and not to heave. And Asha's hand caught his collar with that tomcat swiftness she had. She did not cuff him then. She cuffed him later, when the boat was laughing at them, in the lee of a rock, and then kissed the hurt away in the same breath. He was confused by that lesson. He was supposed to be. When they came into Pike with their stories and their casks and their notes, the hall smelled of wet dog and men who have done work. Balon sat the sea-stone chair with his profile like a cliff seen from a skiff. Euron leaned against a post, his patch like a joke only he got. Victarion stood with his hands behind him, and the blood in those hands had been taught to move at the ship's command, and not at his tempers. Aeron's hair dripped a little because he had been in the water again. Alanis had a piece of needlework that would go unfinished for 10 years, and then be found in a chest and make a granddaughter cry without knowing why. "The North will trade," Asha said. "The sisters will look the other way because they like the view. The Manderleys prefer fat to honor. The reader says the Shields are learning to be proud differently. The red wines count and count. The Rock launches ships that will be beautiful to burn." Balon listened. "We will not burn them while it pleases them to be beautiful," he said. "We will burn them when their beauty has made their captains careless." A raven came that night with a letter that had traveled under bad weather and over worse men. Jon Arryn's hand did not write it. Robert Baratheon's name was at the bottom, and the flourish had the agony of a man who has struck a friend and cannot tell if the hurt is his own or the world's. The words themselves were written by others. Grief rarely holds a quill straight. The hand was dead, in his bed, among his neatness. The city gossiped already. Coughs are not supposed to kill such men. The news moved through the hall like a cold hand put unexpectedly at the base of the neck. Aeron closed his eyes and nodded, not at any god but at a rhythm he had learned to trust. Euron smiled as if a private wager had paid out. Asha's jaw set and then relaxed. She did not know yet what this meant to her, but she knew the shape of the weather changing. Victarion's teeth met and then parted. Balon lowered the parchment into his lap and stared at the fire until one log fell and hissed, and the fire took it into itself as if nothing had changed. "Robert will choose a new hand," Alanis said softly. "He will choose his friend. He will send for Eddard Stark." Balon's mouth did that near smile like the last time. "He will," he said. "And the North will be busy teaching its house to work without its master. Wolves do not like other wolves to watch their dens." He did not drum his fingers. He never drummed his fingers. He had learned long ago that if you invite your impatience into your hands, your men will see it, and then they will know your hands are human. He leaned forward and warmed his palms instead and watched the fire behave. "We will send a letter to Winterfell," he said. "Condolence. Bread is not only a thing with yeast in it. We will offer a ship to carry him to the south under a white flag that no one believes in but everyone honors. He will refuse because he is a man who prefers to walk his duties. But he will remember that we offered. A man remembers who offered him a boat when a river needed crossing." "Then?" Asha smiled because she liked the rhetorical games of politics when they were both honest and flippant. Theon frowned because he felt something sting and did not know what it was, and hated not knowing. Aeron breathed out a syllable in the old tongue that was not a prayer, and not a prayer. Euron's smile grew a little. Victarion said nothing, because he liked the part of any plan that could be accomplished with arms and oars, and preferred to keep his mind empty of the part that could not. In Winterfell, Eddard Stark read the letter and stood by the window until the candles guttered and his breath hung in the air like a reconsideration. He had sons and daughters who would be made different by his going, and a wife whose heart was loyal to her father's river and her husband's frost. He had a friend in the south whose friendship had weathered kingship and excess and the eccentricity of triumph. He had a vow to justice that had been carved into him before he had known what law did to men. He had an offer of a ship that would cut days off his time and put him in the company of men he had grown used to calling enemies and had learned to call something like neighbors. He burned the letter because it seemed right to him to do so. He kept the memory of the offer because it was right to him to keep all the pieces of a game, even the ones he would not play. He rode south with his household guard, and the wind in the Wolfswood had conversations with itself about winter and wolves, and the way one man stepping away from a hearth changes the way the fire chooses to burn. Ravens crossed the sky with the impatience of men late to a brawl. On the King's Road, merchants with the long vocabulary of the road told the story of the hand's death, 3 different ways, and then 3 more. Each story included a woman in different paint, and a cup that had done its work too well. Eddard did not believe any of them. He believed in a cough and a bed, and a neat man who had died close-mouthed with the desire to finish the sentence. It is right that men sometimes die with their mouths closed. It keeps the world from filling with explanations. Balon sent gifts to hold the shape of the world while the world changed its mind. Small casks of pickled fish to Seaguard, with a line about winter that Jason Mallister read with a snort, and then with respect. A narrow, very sharp little knife to Wyman Manderley with a line about carving bread, which made Wyman laugh aloud and then put the knife in his sleeve because he liked the weight of it. A piece of amber with a tiny ancient weed imprisoned within to Roderick the Reader, who held it up to the winter's weak sun and saw, not philosophy, but a trapped green summer and loved it for that. He sent nothing to Tywin Lannister. That is a kind of gift men like Tywin recognize. He sent a strand of sea-dried weed with a line about memory to Eddard Stark through a man who would meet him at the Trident and say it had come from the sea, to which Eddard would put the weed on his finger for a moment and then wrap it in leather and keep it for no reason he could have explained to his daughters. Euron went to sea the night the news of the hand's death came warm to Pike. The silence slid out along water that had remembered how to be black. He did not take many men. The men he took were good at not being remembered by their mothers or by witnesses. He put out no lights and passed 3 lights that pretended they were not ships at all. He did not sail toward any place a map would name. He sailed toward an ocean. When he came back, a week later, his ship smelled faintly of old spice and new fear, and there were 2 women in the hold who had been born very far away and had learned the trick of staring at one point in the air until the world gives up and goes away. Euron took them ashore and housed them in a room that was not a prison, because prisoners know when they are in prison. He made sure they never spoke to one another and never saw the sea. Victarion did not go to see them. He sharpened his axe until it sang and then blunted it again, and then sharpened it once more. That is not the work of a fool. It is the work of a man who does not trust his mind with idleness. Snow came again, properly this time, not shy. It put its hand on the roofs and the ribs of boats, and on the old bones of Naga, and on the faces of men who made a rude noise at it, and went on with tying knots. The sea put on the color it wears when it wants you to know that men are a temporary thing and that it is the permanent one. Asha went off in that weather because there were men along the coast near the Fair Isles who had got into the habit of thinking a long stretch without raids meant that raids were uncivil and would not resume. She took that habit from them and left them with fish hooks that would dance better in spring, and a story to tell about the girl with 2 knives who laughed at a man when he fell off his own dock into his own... Why the hair so... Theon took a fish hook in the thumb and licked the blood off with the same satisfaction as a boy who has found his own body has a supply of red for occasions. The parley on the Blackwater had left its shape on the world. Men had learned how to keep their tempers when they did not need them, and to spend them where a profit could be made. The red wine galleys did not challenge the longships beyond certain marks. The longships did not go beyond those marks often without a good joke and a better reason. Tywin's new ships put to sea for the love of looking like threats and came in again for the love of sounding like money. Stannis' newly decked hulls lay off Dragonstone and counted stars and learned how to bite a current with their keels and not their teeth. Lord Jason Mallister's men learned to sleep with one ear awake and one ear in bed with their wives and not go mad between them. Then the king called a tourney to celebrate his new hand and to make the city remember that men like glory when they cannot afford bread. Word went out that Eddard Stark had come to King's Landing with his pack of wolves and a boy with eyes like a mother's sorrow. Word said that the queen had smiled at a knight in red and that the queen's brother had smiled at himself with the same attention. Word said that a hedge knight with a big laughter had won coin he would spend on nothing wise. Word said that a sellsword had killed a man with a look, and that a small man had laughed at a joke, and that the joke had belonged to him anyway. Balon read none of it. He heard some of it from men who liked to be seen to know things. He put away the knowing with the same precision he used when he put away a knife. He sent a letter south that contained nothing but the words, "The sea remembers." He sent it with a man who would hand it to a man who would give it to a woman who would hold it in her hand, and think of the day she had been happy for an hour, and had told no one. The letter arrived in King's Landing and changed nothing. That is not the same as being useless. A rumor came that Sir Jaime Lannister had ridden out of the city, and ridden in again with his hair damp, and his face set, and a smudge high on his cheek like a man who cannot find the time to wash. Another rumor came that the hand had been wounded, and had slept through his wound, and had woken with old fury and new responsibility. Rumors are the sea on the land. They shape shores over time. Theon listened to them because he was a boy who could not yet help listening. Asha put a hand on the back of his neck and pressed until he dropped his shoulders, and then told him a story about a good brother who had tried to make love to the wind, and had been found next day full of stories and empty of breath. On a sullen morning when sleet painted the world in tiny brief knives, a red wine scout galley came up too close to Orkmont, and put 3 fire pots into a boat shed, and took in return 6 holes in his own hull from men crouched with patience and crossbows, filched from river lords' barns. The galley limped away with its pride broken like an oar pin, and its crew learning to hate the sound of their own pumps. Victarion watched the smoke rise and did not send pursuit. He wrote the lesson down by not ordering the chase. The men cursed him quietly because men prefer the taste of blood to the taste of wisdom. They would later boast of the day their captain taught restraint to their hands. Men like to forget who taught them. Balon put together in his head the shape of things. It looked to him like a net where certain knots had been tied tighter, and certain weights had been moved nearer the edges. He did not yet see the hole that would come, because holes are shy until they gape. He went to the seaward bridge with Asha and Theon, and Aeron, and Victarion and Euron, all together on the planks, because a thing said to all is sometimes better heard than a thing said in corners. The wind put its hand along the rope, and told a joke none of them understood. The sea below made that old sleeping animal sound, that always manages to be both comforting and terrible. "We are not wolves," Balon said, and if he had been a different man, he would have smiled. He did not. "We are not lions. We are not stags. We are not dragons. We are rocks and water and knives. Men remember kings, and they remember boats. Be boats." Aeron said, "What is dead?" And they answered him, "Because it is a way of turning your blood about inside your body and making it warmer." Theon's voice had come down into something new. Even he was surprised to hear it. Asha's voice stayed the same. It had always been sure of where it was going. Victarion's voice was an oar against a pin. Euron's was soft. Softer than he was when he laughed alone. They went down into the hall and ate stew and bread that had not had to be counted as carefully as last year's had. And they held their tongues where speech was of no use, and they sharpened knives that would not be used until autumn. Men went out and came in. Ravens left and returned. Children were conceived, and some died, and some lived and shouted for fish and for dirty stories. The sea stood, as always, and also moved, as always. The bell at Seaguard rang when it needed to, and stayed silent when it could. The Rock added 3 ships, and then 2 odd. The Arbor trained crews to think faster and row longer. Dragonstone's quays learned to know Stannis' step the way a dog knows the step of a man, who feeds it scraps without smiling. The hand in the south did his work. The queen did hers. The king did his. The dwarf measured a shadow. The singer sang. The sellsword dreamt. The butcher who had taught a boy to keep his bow arm steady breathed in, and then out, and found that he could still do both. The world moved along its course that is and is not a circle. And toward the end of that winter, after the first thaws and before the last stubborn ice had relinquished the deep cracks in the rocks below the sea surface, there came a messenger out of the riverlands with a face like old rope, and a letter that bore Hoster Tully's seal impressed shakily upon wax. Lord Hoster's hand had been guided by a daughter's hand and a son's. The words were clear enough despite that. The river wished peace. The bell was ringing men into madness. Men who make grain have learned to fear the sea and are forgetting to look to their hedges, and there are wolves among the hedges. Balon read it and gave it to Asha. She read and gave it to Victarion. He looked at the wax more than the words. Aeron read and laid his hand across the seal, as if closing the eyelids of a dead man who was not yet dead. Euron did not ask to see it. He did not need paper to tell him where the blood would be. "We will write him," Balon said at last. "We will send him 3 words, and then a sentence. The words, 'Your bell rings.' The sentence, 'We are listening.' It is a poor courtesy to pretend men do not exist when they are dying. We will send him also a boatload of hooks. Hooks are honest." "Ben?" He smiled then, actually smiled, and the smile made Theon catch his breath, because it showed him, for a heartbeat, a boy who had been Balon once, and had laughed with his teeth in his eyes. The smile was gone as quickly as spray. The hall fell back into its own rhythm. Men took up their old jobs. The winter lifted one finger of frost and then put it down. The sea counted and did not tell its number. Fair weather came with a stubbornness that felt like a favor. The Iron Victory stretched herself and took her lines with the contentment of a big animal, allowed to run again after being kept in a stall. Asha's longships flickered along the coast like knives catching light. Theon took the tiller for a full watch and did not once forget to look for what the water was telling him. Aeron drowned a man who had murdered his sister for a necklace and brought him back and made him speak his shame and die again more quietly. Euron took his lens and looked at a thing no one else could see and laughed until he coughed. Balon stood upon his bridge and counted, at last, a hole in his net, and did not yet know what shape the fish would be that came through it. He felt it in the rope in his palm, a soft give where there should have been stubbornness. He filed the feel among the other senses he had learned to trust. He went down into the hall and ate and made plans and sent letters and praised small things that deserved praise and punished a man who had taken a boy's knife and lied about it. He slept. He woke. He went back to the rope. He listened. And in King's Landing, beneath a sky that had grown greedy for spectacle, and under banners that had learned to droop in summer heat, like old men's lips, the hand laid his hand on a small boy's head and said something kind and hard. The queen lay upon her bed and stared at a ceiling that had once enchanted her and now made her tired without saying why. The king drank until he loved the world, and then drank again until he did not. Somewhere in a cellar a man sniffed a vial and thought of snow. Somewhere on a wall a man in white looked west and saw flags he refused to recognize and set his jaw about it, because jaw setting is a job too. The sea came in and went out, and the kraken kept its counsel. It does not hurry. It waits under the weight of all plans and all maps and all bells and all kings. It has patience longer than bloodlines. It has seen men with crowns learn humility and men with knives learn law. It will see more. When the rope eased in Balon's hand again, he took his palm away and let the bridge speak to the wind without him and went to find Asha. Because there are some holes in nets that can be closed only with daughters. He went to find Euron too, because there are some holes you must learn whether to close or to widen on purpose, and then own the fish that come through. There was salt on his lips. He did not lick it away. He let the taste stand because it reminded him that the sea had chosen his mouth as a place to speak once, and might again, and that when it did, a wise man does not pretend, the voice is his own. He walked, and the old wood knew his step, and men who loved him without daring to name the love stepped aside, without giving him the insult of making way too eagerly. He looked up once toward the bruise in the west, and the bruise had not yet darkened into storm. He lowered his eyes and saw the coil of rope by the door that a boy had left untidy. He stooped and coiled it, not because of order, though he loved order, but because ropes remember being cared for, and in a winter that has decided to become spring, the only honorable work is to make sure the things that will be asked to save you have been kept ready to do it. He set the coil down. He went to work.